Hello, and welcome to Jason Cavness Experience. I'm your host, Jason Cavness. The Jason Cavness Experience is brought to you by Cavness HR. At Cavness HR, we deliver HR to companies with 400 or fewer people. The HR platform will provide you access to a dedicated HR business partner. Our guest today is Levi Valage-Reed. Levi, ready to be great today?
Yes, indeed.
Levi graduated from Wells College in upstate New York, near the dairy farm where he grew up. Sorry about that. Both of his parents were small business owners and had a strong interest in entrepreneurship. After working in the wine industry in New York for a couple of years and then in government, he studied for his MS in communications at Ithaca College and started a marketing practice. That got him interested in startups and tech, and ultimately he decided to do an MBA at ESADE in Barcelona, where he was fortunate to land an internship with Amazon in Luxembourg. Levi, thank you for being here today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Jason. Thanks for the invitation.
So did you grow up on a dairy farm or just close by a dairy farm?
On a dairy farm, about 100 head for the most part, 100 to 150.
So were you considered like a dairy farmer, a farmer, regular farmer? Like, how's that work?
Dairy farmer, yeah. So it's my dad's farm. If I'd gone into farming, I'd be the 7th generation in the area going into dairy farming.
Oh, wow. That's a lot.
Yeah. The family's been up there for a while. There's roads named after branches of the family in the area. Cornell University has a farm named after the family. They bought it from my great-grandfather. So
yeah. Hey, Levi, could put just a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Let's go.
For the mic?
No, just the chair itself, so they can see you.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Let me try to make sure.
Yeah, I need to do a better setup. So what's the daily life of a farmer? Like, when did you start farming? Were you like 3 years old and your dad kicked you out? Hey, get up at 4 a.m, go milk some cows.
Well, that's pretty traditional in farm families, but in my case, it was a little different. Dad wasn't super enthusiastic about the farming business, and he was pretty dead set against myself or my brother going into agriculture. So we played on the farm, we learned our way around machinery, how not to hurt ourselves, that sort of thing from an early age. But I actually had to argue with him in my teens to get him to let me help out on the farm and start milking cows and operating some of the machinery and whatnot. So a little bit of a different upbringing, I suppose.
Is the farm still in the family?
It is, yeah. It's not a dairy farm anymore. As a sort of active retirement, Dad went into beef cattle farming. Although, as of last update, he has yet to actually sell a cow for beef. And last I heard, he was naming them, which is never a good sign. So we'll see.
No, it's kind of hard to eat something you have a name for, right?
This is true, and the rest of the family starting to question if Dad's really intending to actually sell any of these cows, or if you're really just like keeping cows.
How many cows are on the farm?
Right now, I want to say it's in the neighborhood of 40 or so head.
Man, so you can have 40 personal pets?
Something along those lines, yeah. Maybe, we'll see.
So what are some lessons you learned from being on the farm that, other people might not have by, growing up in an urban environment?
Well, I mean, there's certainly a comfort in a very different sort of environment, right? It's always been sort of surprising to me. I think a lot of people who aren't really exposed to the natural world a lot as children can be very scared of it. And for me, it's sort of the opposite. City environments have always been sort of thrilling and a little scary, but usually in a good way to me. And I tend to feel a lot more relaxed in the middle of a field. That and just kind of learning how to work around big animals, I think, is probably a pretty important takeaway. But I mean, in more applicable senses, I think the thing about farming is, especially a small farm where it might just be one farmer, 1 or 2 people. There's a lot of animals depending on you, right? So I would see my dad get up and he could have a full-on influenza, and he was going to be out there feeding the cows, and he's going to be milking the cows, because if you don't milk the cows regularly, they develop diseases. And that level of grit and persistence, I think, is something that really instilled a certain type of work ethic in myself and my brother from a young age.
So not many sick days on the farm, I'm guessing, unless you're like on your deathbed, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Either that, or if you've got a hired hand. But Dad was the kind of guy who never really trusted anybody else with his cows, so it was typically just him. I remember one time he had a pretty catastrophic accident, dislocated his shoulder and broke some collarbones. And so I was maybe 14 or 15 at the time, and I was helping him with milkings. And after a few weeks, he just stopped telling me when he was doing the milkings. He'd go out and do it himself, one arm up in a sling. And I'd go, hey, where's Dad? And some people, oh, he started the milking. I'd go running out there 20 minutes late to help him out, because he didn't want to ask for help, But yeah, definitely a lot of persistence there.
So I could be wrong, but like most of the big farms, they make a lot of money, but like small farmers, they're pretty much like living paycheck to paycheck, right? Taking out
Exactly
loans
right.
and like it's a real struggle for them.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a big part of why Dad got out. It's difficult, right? Because you look at it on paper, and the assets for the farm can easily be seven, maybe even eight figures, even for a relatively small family farm, especially if land value goes up. But that's also the business. And in terms of day to day, even a small farm like ours grossed six figures, and that was back in maybe the late '90s or early 2000s. But um, nearly all, or sometimes more than all of that, goes back into operational costs. Feed, livestock, maintenance, etc. Um, so yeah, very capital intensive business, typically not terribly profitable. And unfortunately, the trend seems to be increasing in that way. It's really favoring massive operations and aggregation.
And I have to imagine like the insurance cost has to be astronomical on a farm. I would think all the heavy machinery and other work and stuff. I can imagine what it is.
Yeah, and that's one of the motivations I think that makes it really challenging to bring employees on board, right? You'll notice if you go through economic data or labor regulations, OSHA regulations, a lot of these different policies apply to everything except agricultural workers. Agricultural workers are exempt from a whole lot of things, including a lot of different minimum wage requirements. So yeah, it can get really quite complex, and unfortunately, a lot of those exemptions open the door for a lot of labor abuses in the industry. Um, so yeah, it's definitely a very difficult situation.
So next, talk about your time in Barcelona. You spent a year there, right? Just talk about the experience, how you liked it, didn't like it, and just what you gained from being overseas.
Yeah, absolutely. About 2 years there, actually, for the program. But I mean, it was my first time really living abroad. I'd traveled abroad before. Did a backpacking trip through Europe for a couple months after college, which was a lot of fun. But I'd been based in the same hometown my whole life, and so I was just kind of reading the writing on the wall and looking at trends in the kinds of roles that I wanted to go into, and seeing that international experience just seemed to be something that was really important. I'd had an international focus in my undergraduate degree as well. And like a good MBA student, I put together a spreadsheet. I had my hard requirements and my must-haves and my nice-to-haves for each MBA program I was looking at. Ultimately, ended up applying to a few all through Western Europe, because I just decided that was kind of the area I wanted to go for. Right, it was an international experience, but given that I'd never lived abroad before, I didn't want to do anything too alien, too different. Ease myself into it. So I ended up with ESADE in Barcelona just because really ticked all the boxes. It was a long enough program to enable an internship. It offers really, really strong exposure in terms of entrepreneurship. They've got an incubator, literally a startup incubator in the same building as the MBA program. And that really paid off for me. I got an internship with one of the startups there 2 months after landing on campus. And then I was really fortunate as well because I had a really good family friend who was living in Barcelona. She's from there originally. So was able to kind of break out of the school bubble a little bit and actually experience the city. I made it a personal goal to really improve my Spanish. I'm of Puerto Rican descent, but I was raised in the U.S., so my Spanish is pretty rocky. At this point, I'm not sure if it's better. I've got some from Costa Rica because I studied there. I've got a bit of an accent from Puerto Rico because of my family, and now apparently some Catalan inflections, I'm told. So people, native speakers look at me now when I speak Spanish. They give me this confused look, and invariably they go, "Are you Brazilian?" But no, it was really a wonderful experience overall. I mean, I completely fell in love with Barcelona. I fully intend to move back at some point. Um, I love the people there. I like the pace of life. Only really real downside is the salaries. Um, but the experience of total immersion in another culture is incredible, and it gives you I think a new dimension of empathy, right? When you're working with others or talking with others, just to understand the ways in which societies can be different, right? It's not even necessarily unique to people from that area.
Yeah, I think so many Americans miss out on the travel thing. Like I have friends back in Texas. They go the next and over. It's like travel, like doing a big trip, right? And just the culture of different places, how people do different things and see different things. I think a lot of Americans miss out.
I think that's probably true, to be honest. One of the really interesting experiences for me, to be honest, coming back from living in Europe, because I was in Spain, and then for my internship, I also spent several months in Luxembourg. Um, Coming back was just having a new perspective on the differences between different cultures within this country, right? I mean, the U.S. is by global standards is a very large country, both geographically and in terms of population. Um, and the level of diversity that we have, just in terms of sort of cultural heritage throughout the country, is can be really profound. You even see it linguistically, right, in different dialects throughout the country, or dialectical differences in language. And I think it was, before traveling, I would kind of have an attitude like, I don't think I fully appreciated the extent of those differences, and how meaningful it can be to try and understand those different patterns between cultures within the same country. It definitely gives you a different perspective.
Yeah, I think we don't realize how diverse you are in America, right? If you go to Germany, everyone's a German. You go to France, everyone's a Frenchman, right? It's like,
Yeah,
it's different. I think I could make this up. Like, I think there's a neighborhood in Queens, New York, was like 200 languages, 300 people from different countries.
yeah, it's wild. And it's, Europeans get very confused when you talk to them. Why are all Americans identify as something else? You always say you're German. You're not German, you're American. I say, yeah, that's understandable. But the thing is, I think you have to understand the difference between a nationality and, the state to which you belong, right? And in Germany, you're of German ethnicity, you're German nationality, assuming, your family is of German ethnicity, but you're also from the German state. And in the US, there isn't really, an American ethnicity, right? We don't have a single American culture. We have a culture that's built up out of amalgamations of the people who have immigrated here for the most part, right? Obviously, we have native populations as well, but that's, I think, for the average individual, probably not a major part of their cultural experience in this country. And I just, I think that distinction is maybe lost on some folks, and that's why, in my opinion, so many Americans will identify something else, because they're looking for a cultural identifier as well, right? In addition to their point of origin, their state, and I think that's why we have so many. What do they call them? Hyphenated Americans, I think is the term.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So it's a funny story, and this is kind of it might be borderline inappropriate, but it's kind of funny. I remember a caveat when this happened. I was like 19 years old and single, right? So I'm in the army in Germany, and we took and had a trip to go to Barcelona, Spain for like a week, right? So like 20 of us went, right? 20 guys went, right? We're walking around, and this female walks up, like really pretty. Hey, do you want to have a good time and party? Like, yeah, sure we do. How many out there? She's like, well, there's 20 of us. Well, there's only 10 of us, but we can make it work. How much money you got? And I'm like, oh shit. You're talking about that kind of business, and we just like ran away, right?
That's funny. Well, I didn't have any experiences like that in Barcelona myself, fortunately, but that's pretty funny. Yeah, I think you do have to watch out for things like it's pretty common in a lot of major cities through Europe. There's some pretty creative approaches to panhandling and
Yes.
soliciting money.
And we stuck out like a sore thumb, 20 young
Exactly.
American guys with army haircuts, and you could just tell we were like right for getting scammed and conned out of
See a
stuff,
target. I had an experience, I guess, a little bit like that in Paris. I was there for a school thing, and I had the rest of the day, and then I had a flight back at the end of the day. So I was having to carry my little wheelie bag suitcase around with me, and that made me marketers for everybody. And so at the time, there was this scam that a lot of the folks were running there, where they'd come up to you with a clipboard. They pretend to be deaf and mute, and the clipboard was trying to solicit like donations for some imaginary, deaf mute society. So this happened to me a couple times. I waved them off. Then at one point, this woman approaches, same exact clipboard. They were clearly coming from the same source. And this street vendor nearby starts yelling in heavily accented English. He goes, "Hey, it's a scam! Don't pay any attention to her." So she whips around and glares daggers at him. So clearly not as deaf as she was trying to claim. And then she puts the clipboard towards me, and I waved her off, because I already knew it was a scam. And the guy starts yelling something in French. She turns around, starts yelling at him in French, and then in English, he goes, fuck you." I could not stop laughing. Not 10 minutes later, I'm walking down the street. I pass a group of teens. They're all chattering, talking amongst themselves right in front of me. And then one of them kind of breaks off from the group, lingers for a moment as I walk by, and comes up to me with the same damn clipboard. I looked at her and I said, "No." And she gave me this look and shrugged, like, "Well, worth a try," and then ran off to rejoin her.
At least they were persistent.
They were persistent, all right. Yeah, but the ones I encountered in Spain, to be honest with you, were probably worse. There's a tendency there where someone will run up to you, they'll grab your hand, and they'll put something in your hand, small fake flower or something, or they'll pretend to reach your palm or whatever, and then they'll start screaming at you, demanding money, right? So you really have to be quick on the draw. If somebody grabs your hand, you got to whip it back as fast as possible, put your hands in the air. Otherwise, it creates quite a scene, which is pretty unpleasant.
Yeah, we were in Italy for 2 years when I was in the army with my family, and like I don't know if it's the correct term or not. Like the Gypsies were there, and man, they were like aggressive. Like you'd be at the stoplight, they'll come knocking your window, bam, bam, bam.
Yeah.
Like give me some money, right? And they would bring the whole family, right?
Wow.
And then what made it really bad, so in Italy, they passed a law, I don't know why, where like somebody broke in your house, you can only like defend yourself if you felt threatened.
Okay.
So gypsies start sending their infant, like their small children to rob your house, right?
Holy cow.
Like 6, 7-year-old kids, right? And like,
Wow.
and like, are you gonna like beat them up and like shoot them? Like, no, because then you go to jail, right? So they were very, very smart on how they did things.
Wow, that's wild. I mean, I think regardless of the legality, I don't think want to do much to harm a child anyway, even in that
Yeah,
circumstance.
exactly.
But that's pretty intense. I hadn't heard about that. The only encounter, I think the term they use now is Roma.
Yeah, that's it, Roma. That's it,
The
Roma. That's the correct term. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I encountered a few Roma. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I think in Barcelona in particular, and to some extent in France, but definitely in Italy as well. But nothing like that. I mean, definitely some persistence in panhandling, but that was about the
Do you
most
have a
of it.
favorite country while you was over there?
Oh gosh, I mean, well, okay,
All,
so
all the above.
depends on the mood I'm in. Catalonia in Spain is probably, if I had to pick one place I was going to spend a lot of time, that would probably be it. But because to be honest with you, the north of Spain and Catalonia in particular is so dramatically different from the south of Spain. So I couldn't say Spain in general. But outside of that, I think Italian food is, in my opinion, really, really good. Like central and southern Italian food is some of the best cuisine on the planet, I think.
I'll second that.
Yeah, I've been getting into bread making over the past few years, and like about 5 years ago I started. And some of those Italian hearth breads are some of my favorite things to make.
Yeah, like I said, we were in Italy for 2 years, and like we never had a bad meal, right?
Yeah,
It was like at one time a friend recommended, hey, go to this pizza place. It's like 30 miles away where we lived at.
yeah,
And he said this one is gonna look kind of downtrodden, kind of bad, but man, you got to stay for the food. We went there. It was like 90 degrees in the summer. There's no air conditioner. Everyone's sweating. There's flies everywhere. But it took us like an hour to get in, right?
yeah.
So that's the clue. It was good. We got the pizza, like man, it was so good. Like we forgot about the flies, the heat. It was so
Yeah,
good, right?
that sounds about right. My brother and I spent some time in a few days in Rome, and I remember at one point we got a pizza. We walk into this little pizza joint on the corner. Fully a third of the interior space is just the oven.
Yes.
Hardly any other space. It's sweltering in there because this was in the middle of the summer in Rome, and same as you were saying, air conditioning. And I think, and this was just a few years ago, it was maybe, I think it was about €5. We got an entire pizza.
That sounds right.
Pizza. And we both ate some from it, like full meal, had some more that evening, and had it for breakfast the next day. I said, oh my gosh, I think I love Italy. And
Yes.
the wine too. Italian wine is
It's just a house wine. They give it a meal. Some random house wine they make in the backyard or somewhere. It's like just great.
Croatia's like that too.
Mm.
The food in Croatia is very cheap, unbelievably good. And the same with the wine. I remember going to markets in Croatia and buying what I think was Zinfandel in literally a 2-liter like plastic Coke bottle for like 2-3 euros, and drinking that, and it's just incredible. I mean, it's not a wine you'd age, and it wasn't aged wine. It was much younger wine, but just really, really good, really fantastic. And you're buying sketchy looking plastic bottles. It's fantastic, and it's dirt cheap. Honestly, Spain is still like that. Like you get. I went to restaurants personally. I've got photos of menus where a glass of wine is cheaper than a bottle of water, and you
Yes.
get the wine, and it's nothing you're going to write home about, but it's very nice wine, right? It's not bad at all.
No, it's not.
And I say this as a former winemaker.
And another thing about when we was in Germany, like one time my daughter, I think she's in junior high, she had to do a book report on Anne Frank. What we did that weekend? We drove to Amsterdam with the Anne Frank house, right?
Really?
Yeah.
I was in Amsterdam. I couldn't muster up the nerve to visit the house. Yeah, that's wild.
So it's just great opportunities. So next, Levi, talk about how you got involved with tech and startups, how that transition happened.
Yeah, that's a long story, honestly, but I'll try and keep it short. Tell me if I need to fast forward. So you mentioned at the beginning, like you said, I did a master's degree at Ithaca College in communications, and it was really more in kind of the theory and science of communication, I'd say. And a lot of folks from the degree went into HR. Actually, it was a really popular destination. It wasn't really a marketing degree, but that's kind of how I decided to take it. And so after I left my job with government, was trying to kind of stand on my own 2 feet as a consultant or freelancer slash consultant. I had a really lovely design agency I'd done my internship with in Ithaca. And they were just massively supportive. They didn't really do content development, but they did a lot of web development and graphic design. So I started working with them to kind of as a subcontractor, essentially work with their clients. And I got myself an office in a small co-working space downtown in that city. And this co-working space was mostly it was some startups, some freelancers, and the group, two or three, I think two partners behind the co-working space were working on a startup agency idea at the time. And so I got involved in that as kind of a part-time thing and ended up, providing some services to some of the other folks working in the co-working space. And I just started to really fall in love with this. Like, it's, I saw another founder say this on LinkedIn, and I wish I could credit who said it because I can't remember now, but they were talking about the idea of launching a new initiative as making business into almost a form of art or self-expression. And I thought that was such a great way of putting it, right? It was such a fascinating exposure to realize that, these kinds of initiatives that even the biggest companies in the world, in many cases, they were started by someone going, it would be a good idea, and then just doubling down on that, right? That there's so much self-direction and opportunity in this space if you want to take advantage of it. And that level of independence, autonomy, and creativity to me is just intoxicating. So I really loved that work, but I came to realize I was just butting up against a wall. I just did not have the knowledge, the business expertise, the experience to feel that I was set up for success in the space. So that's what led me to do the MBA. And like I said earlier, I chose that MBA specifically because of the entrepreneurial focus of the program. It really is very strong. I looking back, I think I made an even better decision than I realized at the time, to be honest. So I came out of there and I knew at that point that I really wanted some larger company experience if I could land it. Not least to replenish my finances after 2 years living abroad as a student, to be honest, but also just because I'd never worked in a large corporation and I felt that that would be valuable experience to have if I wanted to go and launch a successful initiative myself or find ways to help other initiatives, other startups be successful. So I was very, very fortunate to land the internship with Amazon and even more fortunate to get the full-time offer out of that. So I spent about 4.5 years after the internship full-time at Amazon and tried to stay in touch with new initiatives, ventures, the startup space in whatever capacity possible. So after my first role, because I was assigned to it in retail, I moved out as the first marketing hire for Amazon Lending, a fintech program within the company. Then I moved over to, after that role, to lead an email marketing team at Amazon Advertising, which at the time was just beginning to spin off as its own business entity. I was actually there when they rebranded and the Amazon Media Group and Amazon Marketing Services into the Amazon Advertising entity, which was a pretty wild experience actually to kind of get to witness that firsthand, what that looks like inside of a large company. Um, right around then, we'd launched a couple products there, and I really wanted to learn more about go-to-market processes. So I accepted a role with devices, leading go-to-market for Echo devices at Amazon. Less of a startup focus, but really getting more of that go-to-market experience, which I think, and I'm increasingly coming to realize, is integral to any startup, especially a tech startup, right? There's this, at some point, you're bringing a product or service to market, and that really, in this day and age, is its own discipline. A very engaging one, in my opinion. And then after that role during COVID, I moved over to Amazon Launchpad, which, direct relationship with startups. That's what the program does. It supports new e-commerce ventures and startups on the Amazon platform. Very cool role. That team is fantastic. One of the best teams at Amazon, in my opinion. I really enjoyed it. And during that time, I was working as a mentor wherever I could. And I say working, not in a paid sense, just volunteering, and trying to get involved in as many different organizations and groups in the area, investor groups, accelerators, that sort of thing. I was mentoring residents at Galvanize for a little bit. It was a lot of fun. And right around then, I connected with Jeremy Zaretsky over at Founder Institute, Seattle, as a mentor originally. And after doing that for a year or two, Jeremy invited me to join as a director to help run the accelerator. So I'm still doing that. So, I've always been very inspired by the kinds of folks who work in the startup space who sort of just create their own role. They don't have a fixed job necessarily, with a 9 to 5 sort of structure, or maybe they do and they're doing everything outside that. But they just kind of pull together expertise in a space, build a sort of personal brand and reputation for themselves, and just kind of take projects that they find interesting and engaging. I feel like there's a certain type of individual I encounter in the world of tech startups that sort of fits in this bucket, and that's kind of the direction I think I've ended up finding myself going in. Trying to develop expertise in a relevant area, develop the connections and network in the startup space, and really be able to move fluidly between roles to kind of follow passions and interests. A good friend of mine said to me recently that he's learned not to work against his own curiosity. And I thought, what a brilliant phrase. I love it so much. And I've kind of adopted that as a guide light for myself at this point.
So we got a lot to go through there, but let's go back just for a minute. So
Yeah.
both are entrepreneurs. Talk about how seeing like two parents as entrepreneurs influenced you.
Yeah. There's pros and cons. So they were entrepreneurs in the sense that they had small businesses, not a venture-backed startup or anything like that. So my father, of course, had the farm, as I mentioned. My mother started a dog daycare when I was about, I want to say 10 or 11. Before that, she'd had a baking business. Before that, she'd done daycare for children when I was younger. So lots of different things that she tried out that would enable her to. I was homeschooled up until college, and so was my brother. So she was looking for things that would enable her to kind of still have that level of engagement, and also be able to try and earn some money. The dog daycare, as it turned out, took off. As far as we can tell, it's the largest one in the area, possibly the largest one in the East
And it's
Coast.
still going on right
It's
now.
still going, yeah, very, very successful. And it's really just been, I think, pretty incredible for me to get to kind of watch how that worked out, right, as a child, and watch, being that it isn't a startup, it's essentially its growth was limited deliberately, right, because it got to a point where mom felt that if the business grew any further, it would exceed her span of personal control, and that was where she was comfortable. That's where she wanted the business, which I think is true of a lot of small business owners. And so she's grown it within those confines and managed the business, brought on employees, brought on managers, and it's just been really interesting to watch, someone build a successful business without knowing what they're doing to start, right? Figuring it out as they go. Really quite inspiring. So from my point of view, it was really interesting because I had these great examples of the people of my two parents, operating these two very different types of businesses, and you know the pains that they went through, the triumphs, what led to success, what didn't, how they thought about it. The downside was that I didn't have anyone as a role model for a more conventional path of employment. So I was raised very much with this attitude that office life is more or less death, and you don't take a job like that, unless your life depends on it. And right around my late teens, early 20s, it occurred to me, I thought, neither one of my parents has ever had a job like that. They don't really know. I'm gonna go give it a shot. And that's around when I accepted the role with government, and I decided I actually quite like working in an office. Definitely beats pruning vines in a field in February, I'll tell you that. So as always, I think there's kind of a middle ground, and so part of that course I had to chart for myself, but part of it I definitely had some really excellent role models in my two parents, but definitely a different upbringing, I think, than a lot of my colleagues that I talk to and work with, for sure.
And with the doggy decker, it just proves that you never know what's going to hit it off right. You might think you have
Yeah.
like off the wall idea, you might whatever it may be, but you just never know what people are going to pay for until you put it out there in the
Yeah.
market.
That's exactly right. And that's one of the things, right? Because when it started, a lot of people, myself included, to what extent that was relevant at the age of 10, thought that it was kind of bonkers, right? I mean, this was back, let's see, this would have been right around 2000, 1999, maybe.
So
that
really
she started
bonkers
the
back
business.
then. They like us 2022 where people do that stuff all the time.
Exactly. Now, we didn't know it at the time, but as it turned out, the timing was perfect. We were just riding the crest of, and I say we because I was pretty actively involved in helping with the business in the early days, actually. But there really was this burgeoning social shift in terms of attention towards pets and the money people were willing to spend on their pets. And we had a bit of a clue because there was actually a smaller dog daycare down the street, and the owner was the one who really encouraged my mom to go for it. But she said, "Look, I've got a waiting list that's bigger than the number of dogs I can currently accommodate. I'm desperate for someone to take them off my hands. I'll give you advice to set up." And she did. She came over and gave some advice to set up. And ultimately, they went very different directions with the two businesses. But I think that impetus and initial encouragement was very, very important, to get things going.
Yes. So next, you volunteer for an organization called Built by Girls. Can you talk about that some?
Yeah, that one, unfortunately, not a lot coming through there in the past year or two. But when I started about, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, it's a really cool organization. They're based out on the East Coast. Basically, what they do is they work with young women in high school and college who are interested in roles in the tech industry, both technical and non-technical positions. And they try to match them with mentors working in that industry, both men and women. And they've got a really structured approach. There's a fixed term for each, like advisory match, let's say. And of course, you're welcome to continue the engagement after that if both parties want to, but that's kind of where they set it. They've got a platform where everything and all communication is managed. And then they have a very clear set of expectations for the mentors and the mentees, throughout the course of the program. I think the structure is really nice because there can be so much difference, frankly, in the experience and areas of life of the mentor and the mentee, that often it can be really hard to kind of set expectations, and having that framework makes it really, really helpful.
And all these girls a certain age?
Uh, High school to college. So I'd say, I think the youngest mentee I had personally was probably 17 or 18, and the oldest maybe 22 through that program. And my partner does it as well, and I think she's actually still in touch with one of her mentees who's probably 23 or 24 at this point. But like I said, you can continue the engagement if you want after the fact. But yeah, it's super cool program, and I think it's really great because I talked to some of the young women that I've been matched with through the program, and you just start to realize they just really don't have, in many cases, they don't have great examples of other women, succeeding in these spaces. And often they're really shocked when I'll put them in touch with, my own colleagues, right? Women working in different technical roles, especially, women in very, very technical roles, data science or engineering roles, developer roles, whatever. And getting to have that kind of exposure, some of the conversations we've had after they connected with those people have just been really remarkable, kind of bring a tear to your eye sort of thing. So they just say, I didn't, just never really thought of this as an opportunity or as a possibility. Right now that I've talked to this woman, I've charted like a course for myself if I want to get into this space. A lot of them are really interested in product management. And that's probably just because, that's kind of a technical area that closely aligns with my background. And so that's what I get matched with. But I think it's really, really exciting to see. There's so much benefit that you see to every stakeholder involved, from employees to customers to investors, when you have good gender diversity on a team, right? Everything from the product design and development to return on investment. And I'll say anecdotally, the best teams that I've worked on personally in terms of team culture and just kind of the atmosphere, stress levels, have always been the ones where there's a good balance of men and women, not just throughout the team, but in positions of authority. That's what's really key. There's a lot of teams, and you see this in marketing in particular, where if you just look at the gender balance, it'll often be 50-50 or sometimes even 60-40, more women than men. And then when you break it down by seniority, you get to the first level of management and there's no more women, right? It's all men in management positions. If you can find a team where there's better gender balance, you just tend to have, in my experience, just much better team culture, management culture.
Yeah, I think every stat out there, every business study done forever always says the more diverse your team is, the better ROI, better KPIs, more revenue. I mean,
Yeah,
there's no one study out there that says non-diverse is the way to go. Everything says be diverse and make more money.
that's exactly it.
And it's not even close.
It's not even close. Yeah, you see it in startups too, right? Diverse founding teams in terms of gender diversity. Founding teams with women on average see something like 60% better returns on investment than all male teams. Now, to be fair, I mean, a big part of that is because those teams with women are being discriminated against, right? You just look at the numbers, right? I think it's last year, 2.1% of venture funding went to teams with women, even though teams with women represent something like 30 or 40% of new businesses. So it's essentially a fire sale, right? There aren't as many investors competing to invest in those companies, which means the investors who do are getting better terms, which is not great. So some of that 60% improvement on investment, that's going to change as hopefully we improve this, the allocation of investment dollars. But I strongly suspect we're going to continue to see a trend there, right? If it really, we see those kinds of patterns of better results with better diversity just across the board. I'd be very surprised if that didn't hold true consistently in founding teams as well, even once we start to see better equality among patterns of investment.
So Levi, back to the females in STEM. I'm making this number up, but you get the idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember reading somewhere like in elementary, like 80% of elementary school girls are interested in STEM.
Okay.
By the time they get to senior high school, it's on like 5 to 10%, right?
Sure.
Well, why does that number drop so low? Just societal pressures, or just, and how do we fix that, you think?
Well, I mean, I have opinions, but I'll just put out there, right? I'm disadvantaged on this point in two respects. One, like I mentioned, I was homeschooled. I didn't go to public school. Number two, I'm not a woman, right? So I haven't had that experience, and I can't really, talk to a woman's experience, obviously. What I do see, at least in the tech sector, is just a tacit difference in how women are treated frequently, right? And much to my own chagrin, I've seen this in myself. I was talking to my partner about this the other day. I was having a conversation. I was at my dentist's office, and my hygienist asked me, what my startup does, and I was explaining it. It's a fairly complex topic, so I was trying to simplify it as much as possible. And then a few minutes later, the dentist came in, and so the hygienist was a woman, the dentist is a man, and he asked me the same question, and I was halfway through my description, and I realized, I was just, without thinking about it, using significantly more technical language with the dentist. And I reflected on that after the fact, and I thought, well, is it because I have some idea that he's a doctor, and therefore for some reason more better able to understand this. And I thought, no, that's really not what it is. I think it was just this knee-jerk reaction in my mind that I was reacting differently to the fact that he was male. And these are things I try to be conscious of, and I still find myself engaging in these unconsciously sexist behaviors, right? And so I think if you're not really trying to self-examine and to acknowledge that you do have these biases, I mean, you in the general sense, that one does have these biases and that they are going to manifest, and it's important to be on the lookout for them and try to correct for them, that's just going to be that's just going to be perpetuating, right? Being in marketing, a lot of the teams that I've led personally have been all or majority women. And I've been really fortunate enough to have the kind of women on my team who are not afraid to point out to me when I'm engaged in that kind of behavior, and they have done so. And it's been a very illuminating experience, right? Because I start to realize where my own behavior is perpetuating these kinds of, biases, inequities, or what a lot of people might call microaggressions, and try to improve it. So I guess what I'm getting at is, if we're seeing this among adults, often adults who are intentionally attempting not to engage in this kind of behavior, and you can still see these kinds of patterns, in industry, I can only imagine what it must be like in school with children, right? And like, I mean that literally. I can only imagine. I haven't been in school, but my guess is, years of dealing with those kinds of small, constant, negative nudges, and lack of representation, lack of examples of people who look like you succeeding in the ways that you want to, that has to have an effect, right? And I strongly suspect that's why we see that pattern.
So a good example, maybe from the point of view, a bad example of that. So Sheryl Sandberg, she wrote a book, Lean In, a little while ago.
Yeah.
And so she's telling a story where she met someone at a store, and the lady said, "Hey, I went to your webinar, and I went to your in-person conference back, blah, blah, blah." So Sheryl said, "Well, what do you think?" "Well, actually, I was disappointed." "What do you mean?" "Well, it was good and all, but at the end, you said no more questions. I got to wrap up." And then 10 guys put their hands up, and you let them, all of them, ask questions, but none of us females did. And she's like, "If I'm the head of the lead in movement, I'm doing this. Like, how can I expect anyone else to even do better than I am?" Right? And she's the one saying lean in, and
Wow.
so I thought it was pretty thought provoking when I read that.
Yeah. I mean, it's very thought provoking. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And you start getting into very sticky questions. I know there's been a lot of debate over the past few years about, salary differences between men and women, and to what extent that might be driven by, women maybe not self-advocating as much as
Yeah, I'm a big
men.
believer that's the big reason.
I think there is, but then we have to go a little bit deeper, right? Why is that the case? And I think in a lot of cases the institutions that we have are really doing a disservice to women in those situations, right? I mean, because essentially what we're doing, right, in a situation like that is we're saying, hey, we want a good gender balance because we want good diversity, we want a diversity of perspectives and personalities, right? That's great. But to get here, we're going to need you to conform exactly to the behavioral patterns of the dominant group. That to me seems a little bit absurd and self-defeating, right? So we can look at it and say, okay, maybe women aren't self-advocating, but I don't think the solution is to say, now women, you have to go self-advocate better, right? I think the solution is to look at it and say, okay, what about this situation is creating this problem, and can we remove this particular issue entirely, right? Can we look at something like, for example, better communication of salary ranges up front, for example, or are there other policies or practices that we can engage in that might enable us to welcome this particular type of diversity, this particular difference of behavior, right, without resulting in unfairly unequal outcomes for the participants, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think it goes a step further. And this is like a slight exaggeration, I know much. A guy gets hired for a job. He's over for 6 months. "Hey, boss, I've been on time every day for 6 months. I need a raise," right? And he may or may not get it. A female will like close a $10 million deal, no one or whatever, like increase ROI by 13%. You ask for a raise. "Oh, no, I'm just doing my job."
Yes, I could not agree with that more. I'm not going to go into too many details here because I don't want to give away like personal information or anything, but I have had personal experiences, where I've seen firsthand how men and women on my own team, how their achievements have been received very differently, by peers and superiors within the same organization. I've experienced it is I've had so much more difficulty in my career getting women promoted in situations where I'm not the sole decision maker, than getting men promoted. It, it's 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 exactly like you're describing, right? The same achievement, right? For a man might do something and they'll say, well, he's showing great potential, and a woman might, be in the same exact situation. They say, well, she hasn't accomplished this yet, right? Well, wait a minute, that's the definition of a double standard, right? And women say this all the time because they experience it personally and they see it. But I'm what I'm talking about is the kind of thing that happens behind the closed doors, away from the people in question, between the decision makers who in organizations that engage in this kind of thing are typically predominantly male in the management structure, right? And they don't mean to be malicious. This isn't a conscious, well, I hope it's not a conscious discrimination, but it's still happening. They're looking at the two candidates, the two situations through entirely different lenses. They don't even realize they're doing it, right? And I shouldn't say I should say we, because I'm 100% certain I'm guilty of this as well. That's what I'm talking about when it's incumbent on us to acknowledge that whatever our intentions, we're almost certainly engaging in this kind of behavior, right? As individuals and as professionals. And so it's important to recognize that. Recognize that doesn't mean that you're a bad person, right? We're all human, we make mistakes. But it does mean that you have some moral responsibility, I personally would argue, to try and accommodate that fact, to acknowledge it, and try to find ways to correct for it if possible.
And like I said, everyone has bias. Like you might decide between like who you want to promote, Bob or Susan. And you might not know it, but in the back of your mind, but you're like, hey, Bob is single, no kids. He can be a guard, hold, get hard.
Yeah.
Susan, she doesn't have any kids yet. I know she's married and she's going to the itch, and we're going to lose her for like whatever time it is. So let's promote the male,
Yeah, I've had some of these conversations where someone will ask me, I want to hire so and so, or I want to promote so and so, and they'll say, oh, they'll start asking questions, and after a couple minutes, I go, are you trying to figure out if she's going to have kids soon? It's just super not okay. One little technique I like to try and use, I forget who suggested this to me, I didn't come up with it, but it's just to try and imagine if you can switch the genders, and just try and think, would I think about this person or this situation the same way if the genders were reversed, right? Or if they were changed in some way. And if you can really kind of commit to that little thought experiment, it can be surprisingly revealing. I mean, like in the example I gave you earlier of my own experience with my dentist and hygienist. But even that's imperfect, right? It's difficult to do, and it doesn't always occur to one to try and do that. But it's a start.
So last Saturday, I went to this event at the Boeing Museum of Flight. My friend Kerry G put on. It's like a panel of aviation military people, like retired.
Oh, wow.
And so, or like one lady, she's a YouTube pilot. Another lady is like flew the two, like did some great stuff, right? And so one lady, I can remember her name, retired Air Force colonel, 30 years, flew all time aircraft, right? She's a senior person in the civilian side of the Air Force at an Air Force base in California. And she tells me at least once a month, someone asks her, who do I turn my security passes into, right? And she said one time this low-level employee was explaining to her how an engine works. And so like, I'm a retired colonel, blah, blah, I have 2 masters. Let me tell you how it works, right? And it's like, this is ridiculous, right? It's like,
yeah, that's really, really remarkable. I mean, the closest I can relate to that is throughout my life, it's been very, very common when I'm in a place that someone will assume that I work there, especially if it's kind of a retail position, right? If I'm in like a Best Buy or something, or a restaurant, it's very common. It's happened several times at Benaroya Hall, actually, when I go for the symphony. My partner and I really enjoy doing that. And I've had people come up to me and assume I'm an usher, even though the ushers wear uniforms that look nothing like the clothes that I would be wearing at the time. So I think it's the closest I can relate because I never really thought much of it. And then when my partner and I first started dating, she's white, and I was describing this experience, just kind of assuming it was something that happened to everybody. She said, it's never happened to me, and she got very upset the first time it happened in front of her because she felt that it was very racist, right? That given my darker complexion, that people were maybe more inclined to assume that I worked in a place. And since then, talking to folks who work in DEI and just kind of reading up on it myself, I've learned that is in fact a pattern that's seen among people with darker skin. I had no idea. And it frankly can get quite irritating. Sometimes people will get downright unpleasant. If they think you work there and you're not responding the way they want, or sometimes when you tell them you don't work there, if they've gotten themselves all worked up at that point, I think it's hard for them to let the anger go.
What they call it, the Karen complex.
I wasn't going to call it that, but yeah, it's a little bit of that. Yep. I had a lady one time in a shopping mall I was in. She came storming out of the bathroom. She was mad as hell about something. And she comes up to me and starts telling me how there's so much water on the floor and someone could slip and hurt themselves. And I am completely confused, right? I'm trying to figure out, did she think I spilled something? And then she pauses mid-tirade. I think she saw that I was completely confused. And she goes, "You work here, right?" I said, no, I don't work here. I have no idea why she thought I worked there. I literally walked out of the bathroom. I was still, drying my hands off. I was not wearing anything passing for a uniform. And I said, I don't work here. And she goes, "Oh," and then resumed the tirade. Just my employment status apparently had made no difference in that case. So I basically ran away. I wasn't about to deal with that. But yeah, it's that and getting followed around stores and whatnot. But anyway, the point I was going to make is that's about as close as I think I can relate to the experience that you just described. But I think every woman I know that I've broached this topic with has at least one really good story along the lines of what you just described. And it's made me try to be much, much more careful because, again, I've realized a tendency in myself to launch into an explanation of something with women, whereas with men, I'll more frequently stop and ask if they're familiar with it already, just without thinking. And so I try to be a lot more conscious about that. Because that's the other thing you see, right? A lot of women, at least in my experience, will often, in the interests of being polite, will not say anything, right? And they'll let you go on. And a lot of men will not because they're very eager to prove to you they know what you're talking about. And that's just not a situation that I want to create. I appreciate the kindness, but I think it's not great to present that kind of double standard.
Yeah, and it's bad when it makes it on primetime TV. You see a TV show where they have a business meeting and the lady will have this idea, blah blah blah, and like that's stupid, Susan. Sit down. And like seconds later, Bob say exact thing. Bob's a genius. Susan, how can you think about that? Susan's like, I literally just said the same thing.
There's some good. I think there's a Pixar short on more or less that topic, and then there's I hope I'm remembering her name correctly. I think it's Sarah Cooper, the comedian. She's ex-Google. She actually has a special on Netflix. She has online some really biting pieces about these kinds of phenomena. Very entertaining to read, and frankly, very educational. Right, as a guy, right, you read these kinds of things and you go, "Oh yeah, like I've seen this. I didn't realize this was a pattern associated with sexist behavior or prejudice, whatever." It's really interesting to see those kinds of things. But yeah.
And then like you're a company you started with KCB, you're like, I want to hire, I want to be diverse, right? But first thing one thing I think we got to agree on, like diverse hiring is not easy, right? You just can't say, I'm going to hire this demographic, right? First of all, they do have to be qualified and they have to want to work for you, right?
Yeah.
And all that kind of stuff. Like, you're just going to say, I'm going to hire X, Y, Z and manage to compare, right? So it's harder than thinking people is, right? Then if you're a startup company and you have 10 white guys, can you really go, I'm going to hire a Hispanic female?
Yeah.
Like, why would that person, anyone non-white, want to come work for you, right? The culture is a bro culture. You're probably playing ping pong beer, like, and I understand it's hard to be intentional, right? When you start a startup, you might want to hire your friends because you trust them. They have the skills you need, but it's a challenge, I think, all the way across the board.
Absolutely. Yeah. I completely agree. And that's no excuse for shying away from it, but I think it is important to acknowledge that it is a challenge. I remember when I was in my MBA program, we had one of those real world projects we were working on. We had a startup in the city that I think they had around 14, 15 employees at the time. It was a tech startup, so mostly engineers. And they had recognized that they had extremely poor gender diversity in their team. And they had, like, again, out of around 15 people, they had 2 women. And they said they were really struggling to get women to apply to their roles, and they weren't sure what they were doing wrong, and they wanted to see if we could help. And so, this startup was assigned to us as a team to try and come up with some ideas for their hiring. And I remember, they shared with us some of their material, their website for hiring, a little brochure thing they had. And I started cracking up when I saw it. I said, well, I see a big problem right off the bat. You've got all of your photos of the entire team. It's all these guys, they got the front row kneeling down and the back row standing, and all these guys in there, they're smiling and everything. And every single photo, the 2 women looked like someone was holding a gun to their head, right? Arms crossed and like.
Yeah, not the best optics. You're trying to hire females.
Incredibly uncomfortable. And I looked at this.
Like,
and I thought, okay,
we're prisoners here. Don't come.
Yeah, exactly. They looked not just unhappy but unsafe, right? Just their body language was screaming this. And I said, I mean, that's something you got to deal with. Like, why do these women feel this way? Because clearly something, it was every photo, both women, this body language in every case. And I said, that's something I think you guys got to address. Um, Unfortunately, I never did find out exactly what the company culture was like because it was only a couple weeks project. Um, but I think you really have to approach something like this as a true believer, so to speak, right? If you're coming at it and you're going, well, we need more women on the team because it doesn't look good that we don't have enough women on the team. No,
Yeah,
that's
it's
not
not a
gonna,
good answer.
you need to be coming at it from a direction, in my opinion. And let me say up front, I am not and do not pretend to be a DEI professional, but as a manager, the way I think about it is you need to understand why it is important to have gender diversity, what benefits and value it brings, both in a purely pragmatic outputs oriented sense, but also in a social equity sense, right? I mean, I can't speak for others, but I'm really uncomfortable with the idea that uh, my own behavior is unfairly discriminating or preventing people from fair access to good opportunities, right? Um, and I think you really need to embrace those concepts. You really need to be motivated by a desire to correct those two issues, right? Or to take advantage of the opportunity in one case and correct the issue in the other case. And then the biggest thing, people talk about, oh, it's so difficult, it's so hard. Well, my response is generally listen more, right? There's plenty of people out there who have had these experiences who can give you some ideas on, how to improve, how to avoid creating, bad environments, bad situations, or mimicking the same mistakes that have been happening for decades in the professional world, or centuries probably. Um, but it's a question of having the humility really to be willing to go out and just listen. What is wrong? What is broken? How do we fix it? Um, and I think if you can do that, honestly, that could be steps 1 through 3 for a lot of the organizations I've been part of. Frankly, you don't, that's even before trying to hire a DEI professional or anything like that. Just go talk to people. Listen, what are the problems? What are the pain points? What can be corrected? The folks experiencing this in your organization, they're going to be your best authority on how to correct the problems that are preventing you from, improving diversity, if that's really your goal.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that you should hire the best person for the job. However, said that, I also believe that you go to any demographic and find the best person for that job.
So that's such a great point, right? People talk about hiring the best person for the job. Absolutely, I agree. But what are the odds that the best person for the job is consistently a white dude named Chris?
Every single time.
Right? For example. Yeah, exactly. And you have to look at that and go, okay, maybe there's another problem at work here. So then my big question is always, you say you want the best person for the job. How are you evaluating that? That is inherently subjective. There's maybe
And where are you recruiting at? Are you going the same recruiting fair in Bellevue every single time?
Right. Or, at an even more granular level, how are you evaluating the outcomes of their resume, the outcome of their interview? What kinds of questions are you asking? Right? Are they different? So when you can make it and I think this is why there's a lot of research, and it hurts me to say this because I despise standardized testing, but that's found that you actually get better hiring outcomes with a standardized approach, often with tests that don't involve, a human interviewer. Because it falls into the same pattern when you can make decisions like this, using an algorithmic approach, consistent objective approach. Even a very simple one often outperforms a subjective, quote unquote, expert opinion. And I think you see this in hiring as well. And where I think you see a really dangerous mix, right, is when you have an approach that is fundamentally subjective, because it is, and you pretend that it's objective, right? You put some kind of numeric scale to it, or some kind of an assessment protocol that breaks things down into numbers. It gives this veneer of objectivity, but it's false. But the problem is when you have a veneer of objectivity, you stop questioning it, right? You go, okay, well, this person's an 8 out of 10. It's been decided, and therefore, stamp, we're done, right? No, that's a subjective assessment. Just because you've given it a number grade rather than a letter grade or a qualitative evaluation doesn't make it any less subjective. And as soon as you have subjectivity, you have room for bias. For example, myself personally, when somebody says to me that they're a good judge of character, it's an immediate warning sign. And apologies to anyone who's a good judge of character out there. But the reason it's a warning sign is because if you believe that you're a good judge of character and you make a snap decision about me, that's based fundamentally on intuition, on emotional reasoning, right? If it's not based on something objective, then that's where it's coming from. Which means that it could be based on inherent biases that I have no control over, right? You may have had some bad experiences with people who look like me. maybe you grew up in a bad neighborhood that was populated largely by Puerto Ricans, for example, right? And you were scared of them. That's completely legitimate. And maybe now as an adult, you don't necessarily associate that consciously because you recognize that, just because some members of an ethnic group behave a certain way doesn't mean everyone in that ethnic group behaves a certain way. But your emotional mind, your subconscious mind hasn't internalized and digested that, right? There's some really interesting, I was just reading a book called The Righteous Mind, really interesting book. They were talking about research where people have an immediate good, bad, like visceral emotional reaction to literally everything, right? And it colors their conscious assessment of that thing, person, experience, whatever, afterwards in a way that they're not even, aware of. So if you have a deep-seated subjective bias against people with darker skin tones, as many Americans do, frankly, probably myself included, right? This isn't saying anyone's a bad person. It's not something you have control over, but you need to be aware of it. So if you have that bias, that's affecting your assessment of people. If you believe yourself then to be a good judge of character, guess what? You're now less critical about your own opinion, guaranteed, right? You're not going back and questioning it because if you're a good judge of character, then your judgment of character must be good, right? That's the kind of tautology that we tend to engage in mentally. And that means that, people subjected to your judgment of their character have very little recourse to change your assessment, right? Because it's generally not going to be based on something practical or objective. So, that's why I feel like, we need, if you read like Daniel Kahneman or all the behavioral psychologists, he talks about our, I think it's system 1 and system 2. Basically, the distinction is between our autonomic sort of heuristic processes, right? Where we evaluate something and we make a snap decision, it feels good, versus the more cognitively intense reasoning activities, what we might consider more of a rational thought process, rational cognition. And we typically tend not to engage in that kind of cognition as much. It's energy intensive, it takes more work, and it takes time. But in these cases where you're trying to suss out, inadvertent discrimination and bias, it's very, very important, in my opinion, to be engaging that system as often as possible, to constantly be questioning subjective assessments and subjective decisions and the processes by which you reach those decisions.
And what gets me, it kills me all the time. Someone says, I'm a hiring expert. Are you really? Like everyone you hired went on to have great careers in your company, right? Like you didn't make no bad hire decisions. I'm a hiring expert. That's okay. I've never believed that people. I heard people say that.
What does that mean, right? Define your terms. What does that mean? You see there's a lot of research showing that women will on average apply to a job when they exceed 100% of the minimum requirements.
And men
it's like 70%.
Yeah, and men like, oh well, I can read the. If I can, as long as I read, I can apply for it.
Exactly, and I will say personally, absolutely. If I meet about 70% of the minimum requirements, I'm applying to that job, assuming I want to, right? And I've seen that as a hiring manager as well. And this is why, I was just thinking about this yesterday. I think in the course of my career, I've definitely hired a lot more women than men, and this isn't out of preference or anything. It's just because I have a sort of system that I personally developed for evaluating candidates as well as objectively as I can. So I've stolen the rating system from Founder Institute. They've got a really interesting approach for evaluating founder pitches. And then my inputs are, if I'm working with a recruiter, whatever the recruiter tells me, then the person's LinkedIn and their resume. And then if it's a creative role, then their portfolio as well. And then what I try to do is I go through and I assign a numeric score for each of the candidates I have in front of me to each of those items. And I'll do like all the resumes first and then all the LinkedIn profiles, et cetera. I try to keep myself as distant from the person as possible. So, if I can separate names, I'll do so. I try not to look at, images like, headshots or whatever. And then at the end, I go and I'll add up all the scores. And what I'll frequently find is that the candidate that ends up coming out, as the top candidate is not the candidate that I would have selected. In fact, it's almost never the candidate that I would have subjectively selected just based on my own sort of gut reaction to their different profiles. And that candidate, I think it's safe to say roughly 90 to 95% of the time is typically a woman, because the women who apply to the roles are typically far more qualified than the men who apply to the same roles. And that's just consistently been my experience across several different companies. So I look at that and I go, well, if I'm hiring, the best candidate for the role, I've got someone here who is approachable, open to learning, has demonstrated extremely strong expertise, has more years of experience and more, quantifiable accomplishments. Just it's kind of a no-brainer once you look at the resume, the accomplishments, and the CV. And so that's just how it's kind of panned out. So when a company tells me that they want to hire the best person for the role, and I see a whole bunch of guys who all kind of look the same, have and I say look the same, not in terms of like physical features, but look the same in terms of their profile, right? You know, their history, where they went to school, maybe their age, whatever. I have to really question that. You know, I don't think you're hiring the person who's best for the role. I think you're hiring the person that you feel most comfortable with, right? And that's a different thing. But that's a characteristic of that autonomic heuristic system, right? It's substituting the question being asked, who's the best person for the role, for the question that you want to ask, or the question that's easier to answer, who's the person I'm most comfortable with, right? And I think that's what you kind of see happening in a lot of these types of hiring processes. But again, just my opinion.
Yeah, you always hear people that are, no, do they pass a beer test? Well, does passing a beer test make them the best person in the job?
Yes.
And we're supposed to be professional, right? I mean, does it matter you get along with the people you work with? Yes, maybe it does, but does it matter more that you perform in the job, you know?
Yeah. I mean, you have to get along with them, but it doesn't mean they have to all have to be the kind of person you want to hang out with after work with a beer, right? I mean, I've got plenty of friends I'd love to hang out with after work for a beer. I wouldn't necessarily want to work with those folks.
Yeah, I got plenty of friends like that. I'll have a beer with them, but
Yeah.
I will not hire them to cut my grass. Much less work when I started with them.
Yeah. And same token, some of the best people I've worked with, you know, we just don't really click on a social level, right? It's not that we dislike each other. It's just like, you know, we wouldn't really particularly enjoy hanging out for 2 hours over a beer and having a conversation. We're just different people. We don't click that way. That's fine. But you know, if we can work well together, if we can work effectively together, that's what matters, because you're talking about hiring an employee. You're not hiring a buddy, right? Um, and I think that's important. I cringe a little bit when people talk about, you know, the beer test, the airport test, whatever, because to me that's the height of, that's not just accepting a high level of subjectivity. It's actually prioritizing it, right?
Yeah.
And that to me is problematic.
Especially everything be remote now. Like if you're remote, does a beer test even matter at all?
That's a great point. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, in a remote environment, when I'm hiring for, I'm looking for people who can be self-directed or autonomous, people who like having that kind of, you know, ability to set their own schedule and set their own priorities. Um, you know, I talk about, half joking, but with my teams and direct reports, that I like to describe my management style as, I call it my snowplow theory of management. My idea is that as long as I'm leading teams, you know, full of these very highly capable professionals, very self-motivated professionals, which is, you know, not 100% true across the board, but I've been really fortunate in my career that those are the kinds of people that I've worked with, and I really enjoy that. You know, my role is really, they've got the motivation. They know they want to accomplish, they want to achieve. My role is to set them up for success and enable them to do that. It's to clear the path, get the crap and the bureaucracy out of the way, make sure that they have the tools and resources they need, and make sure that they're not being, you know, bogged down with minutia and busy work, so that they can actually accomplish things. And essentially just to make sure they're pointed in the right direction on a clear path, right? And be there for support and whatnot. And I've just found really fantastic results with the teams that I've been fortunate enough to be part of, with that approach. Um, and you know, coupled with that, I'm a really strong believer in the idea that people who are self-motivated, people who care, um, about what they're doing, and I really think if people don't care about what they're doing, then there's a problem with the situation, likely not with the person that needs to be addressed. But you know, folks who are in a good situation where they are motivated, they want to be successful, right? And if you give that person, if you treat them the way as though they're in the position you want them to be, you give them the trust that you want them to deserve, people rise to the occasion, right? And I always say, you know, I think it's probably, you know, it's got to be 90% of the time it works out. But I'll tell you, you know, I've been leading teams for 5-6 years now. I haven't had a single instance where somebody has, you know, let down that sense of trust, or betrayed the trust I put in them, or let me down in terms of their, you know, their drive to be successful. Not a single instance, right?
So, Levi, let's go back to your homeschool years.
Yeah.
By being homeschooled, do you think you missed out anything on the social aspect of growing up?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, you know, it was pretty isolating, because also I grew up on a farm, right? So I was out in the middle of the country. So I had a couple childhood friends, but and my brother, but definitely, first couple of years of college were very challenging from a social perspective. And I remember, and I've talked to my brother about this too, you know, having this surreal sense, feeling a bit like some sort of strange alien anthropologist, right? Observing my peers in their natural habitat and trying to figure out how to imitate them to you know, fit in and not be a total weirdo. I don't know that I quite succeeded. I'd still say I'm quite a weirdo, but I think at this point I'm pretty comfortable with that.
So, Levi, after Amazon, you went to work for a company. and you did a product market launch that didn't go that well.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the lessons learned and mistakes you made that you learned from to make yourself better?
Great question. So I joined a healthcare company, multinational healthcare company, and I came on board in a pretty cool role. They were looking to launch a consumer-facing product, consumer-facing brand, I should say, for the first time in the US. And so I was basically, it was what we call like an entrepreneurial role, right? So I was setting up a team and a business unit, owned a P&L. But instead of having to go solicit investment, I was basically just getting a budget assigned by the company. So very, very cool opportunity. But I think the challenge was that coming into the company, the situation was a little different than how it was represented before I joined. It was represented to me, that basically they were just looking for someone to come on board, get the pilot going, and then they were off to the races. And in reality, there had been some initial proposals put together for this role, for this initiative, but there wasn't the executive alignment that needed to be there at the upper levels to really move forward. And so some executives wanted to move forward, some were ambivalent, some were pretty steadfastly blocking the initiative. So, in my time there, I built out a team, set up a turnkey pilot, had things ready to go, and literally 48 hours before we were due to launch the pilot, one of the executives, who I didn't know at the time was not in favor of moving forward, asked me to pause, temporarily, while we sorted a few concerns out. So I said, okay, no problem. We paused for a couple weeks, and that pause turned into a month, into 2 months, into 4 months, and I was trying a number of different approaches to the pilot to see if, to try if different scale, different channels, different levels of control over the pilot, in terms of like restricting participants and whatnot, if anything would make the executives in question a little bit more comfortable and allow us to move forward. And just wasn't having a lot of luck. And I finally got to the point where I thought, I moved into this role as a sort of soft landing into entrepreneurship, and I wasn't getting to move forward, and I decided I was just getting tired of spinning my wheels, and that's why I left to join the startup where I'm at now. But I think in terms of learnings, the biggest thing for me really would just be to put more effort into really asking the difficult questions about where those executives were at and where the status of the program was, right? Why wasn't it moved forward while I was going through the interview process? What was holding things up? What did they see the next 3 months looking like, the next 6 months? What were the big pain points or concerns around moving forward, that kind of thing. It's really the same thing, honestly, that I tell any mentee as they're approaching a new job is, just the same kinds of questions you'd ask a hiring manager, right? Really just to kind of try and get at the thing is, you can't ask a question that's just straight on the nose typically. What do you think of this project or what have you? What you need to ask are questions that put people into a mindset that's very specific. So for example, I tell mentees sometimes, rather than asking someone, what's a great achievement in this role that I'm applying for? What does success look like in this role? My suggestion is to ask a hiring manager, let's imagine it's 9 months down the road and you're reflecting on my time here, and I've been a really, really great employee. What have I accomplished in the last 9 months that makes you feel that I was a really good hire, right? Now, it's a really convoluted way of asking the same question. But what I found in my personal experience is that hiring manager, it goes back to that system 1, system 2 thing I was talking about, right? If I say, what does success look like? They go, oh, well, you've got to, execute projects to a high level. And if we're talking Amazon, right, you've got to, exemplify the Amazon leadership principles. Okay, great, but that's really generic. That doesn't help me. When you ask the question the way I just rephrased it, in my experience, what I've seen is the hiring manager will stop for a moment, right? And you can see they shift into system 2, right? They're thinking more critically now. They go, oh, okay. And then they give you a real answer. And it's usually something along the lines of, well, we have this project we're working on, and these are the points we haven't been able to move forward. And if you were able to resolve this, this, and this, that would be huge, right? Boom. Now, as an applicant, you've got your roadmap, right? You've got a concrete set of clear objectives, hopefully, that tell you if you can do this, you will be successful in this role. And that's a gold mine. So I think applying that same perspective, going in and in the early days in the role would have been really, really helpful. And this is a lesson I learned doing freelance, and I really should have applied it here, but live and learn. I think it would have been really helpful if I had approached my project and the executives at the company not as my management, but as my clients, right? And what I mean by that, and you maybe have experienced this yourself, actually, Jason, you'll often find when you work with a client, they'll say, I need XYZ, right? And you go, okay, and it's a deliverable, it's a thing. You go, but what are your goals? And then they'll tell you your goals, and you'll go, you know what? That's not what you need. If this is your goal, what you need is this, right? And it really, you have to take the time and effort to dig into the client's requirements, because the one thing I've learned in marketing, at least, is what the client tells you they need and what they actually need are nearly always two different things. And I think it was the same case here, right? And I just unfortunately was going in much more with an employee mindset and not as, an owner mindset, which is you can't admit that at Amazon, you get crucified, but I'm safe now. But I think that was the biggest thing, honestly.
So Levi, can you talk more about your role with Founders Institute and exactly what is Founders Institute?
Yeah, I this is one of my favorite topics, so you might have to tell me to shut up. I love Founder Institute. So Founder Institute is a pre-seed accelerator. So an accelerator is a program for startups that does exactly what it says. The idea is to basically say, okay, you don't know what you're doing, that's okay. We've looked at what startups do to be successful. We know what startups need to accomplish in their first, 30, 60, 90, 120 days, whatever. So by enrolling in this program, we're going to set you on the straight and narrow and really kind of crack the whip, so to speak, to make sure it gives you sort of that peer group incentive, right? To stay on track, get your reports in, and have accomplishments that you can speak to. So it's very motivating in that respect, in the same way that, say, college is motivating with grades and deadlines, So the idea is basically, to take a process that could take 6 months to a year without guidance and condense it down into 2 or 3 months. Now, most startups accelerators focus on a particular age range of the startup, right? Pardon me. That's right around, I would say, pre-seed up to seed. Founder Institute is one of very few, the only one that I'm aware of at this scale, that's very, very early stage. So we'll bring people in who don't have a startup, they have an idea, and they want to go dip their feet in the water and figure out if the startup is right for them, all the way up to folks who are getting ready to raise their pre-seed. That's kind of our window.
So Levi, can you be too late to apply for Founders Institute?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're at a point where you've got several employees and maybe, you've already raised some substantial capital, maybe you're raising a seed round and you've already raised pre-seed, there's a good chance, there are exceptions, but there's a good chance you might actually be too mature for Founder Institute, at which point we maintain, strong relationships and networks with other startup related organizations, investors, whatnot. So here in Seattle, for example, we'll often refer people to Techstars, which is excellent accelerator. A lot of our top graduates will actually go into Techstars right after, because the two programs mesh really well. We are very much, if a startup, is really appropriate for Founder Institute, they are not ready for Techstars. If they're appropriate for Techstars, they're too mature for Founder Institute. There's really no overlap. So, I think that's really great. In our case, if a startup is too mature for us, not really a problem. There's a wealth of resources available for them, right? If they're appropriate for us, there aren't that many. There just aren't that many resources available. One of the big reasons I joined FI and I've stayed involved with it for so long is just because the organization is really well run. It's very organized. It's very professional. Things are very standardized. It's also got a really strong focus, even though it's very much, an accelerator for venture-backed, or ideally soon-to-be venture-backed startups, right? Profit motivated. It's got a really strong social impact aspect as well. Startups are asked, for example, to align their models and products with some of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as part of the application process. There's a very strong ethos of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and social impact throughout the program, which is something I appreciate a deal. But overall, just the execution of it, the organization, the kinds of mentors that we get in, it's everything is held to a very high standard, which I really, really enjoy. So it's super cool. And getting to work with startups at that early stage, for me, frankly, it's one of the most rewarding parts of my career. It's so much fun because you're working with people who have deep expertise in whatever they're doing, typically. Need a lot of help in other areas, which is fine. It's great, right? That's why we're there. And they're really passionate about what they're doing, right? Like that's why they're in this space. They've got something that they are excited about. And that level of excitement and passion is it's contagious in the best possible way. It's incredibly energizing to work in that environment. So I love it. And on top of that, like the founders themselves are really cool people, like from all kinds of walks of life, all kinds of experiences. What they have in common is that they are driven, very intelligent, very capable, and have deep levels of expertise in, you know, whatever subject matter area that they're trying to move forward in. And so I always kind of laugh at the end of a cohort because I'll have a couple founders who will, you know, I've just clicked really well with, who maybe needed the marketing experience, which is my forte. You know, and they'll say, oh, you know, thank you so much for the help and blah blah blah. You know, we've learned so much, and I always kind of laugh because I'm like, invariably, I always feel like I've walked away learning way more from our founders than anything I always feel kind of guilty, like they've given a lot more to me than I've contributed. I know it's a little bit cliche to say that, but it's genuinely true. You can't sit in an environment of, you know, 10 to 20, you know, brilliant, motivated experts in their field and not walk away with a lot more than you started with, you know.
So I know what accelerators like Techstars, Y Combinator, they give you like a certain amount of money to take equity, but Founder Institute has a different method for that, right?
A little bit, yeah. So there is a fee for the program, although we offer a lot of fellowships and scholarships, because the idea here, and this is something I believe really strongly in, is that, you know, that's all for basically the operational costs of running a program. But we really want it to be as accessible as possible. And so if someone's coming forward, you know, and they can't afford it, we really, at least in the Seattle chapter, we really bend over backwards to try and make it work if we can. That's something that's really important.
And so you said Seattle chapter. So there's like chapters across the United States and across the world.
Across the world, we've got, I think there's something like 200 chapters now globally. Yeah, all around the world. Super cool, which is another cool benefit, right? I've got networks now in, you know, Senegal, Lebanon, China, all through Europe, all through the US, North America, Latin America, right? Just through Founder Institute.
And then each cohort actually gives up like 1% of the company to everyone else in the cohort, correct?
Yeah, so it's so they just changed the equity model, and I know there's less equity. I think it's 2.5% now for the program. It used to be 4%. So I think broadly the model is pretty comparable. I have to confess I'm not super familiar with it yet because we haven't run a cohort. Our chapter in Seattle hasn't run a cohort since they changed the model, so I haven't really dived into the details. But the previous model, it was 4%, but it's not given up front. It's about 2/3 of the way through the program was when companies then committed to the equity component, and they could choose to drop out at that point if they didn't want to commit to the equity component. Again, I know that the timeline here in the process has changed, but just to give you an idea of the kind of the thinking behind it. And then that 4%, some portion, I think it was 1% goes back to Founder Institute as part of, like, you know, operational costs. 1% goes to the local leadership team. So that would be, you know, myself and my colleagues. Then 1% went to the mentors. I think I have these numbers right. Big apologies if I don't, but like I said, it's changed anyway, so I guess it's irrelevant. Anyway, the remaining portion then went to a pool, which is then divided among all the founders in the cohort who graduate. So you're giving up a portion of your equity, but you're buying it. Well, not buying it, but you're gaining a share of a pool that includes equity.
So you hope you get some high qualified cohort members with your cohort.
Absolutely. But what I really love about it is what it does is it incentivizes the local leadership team, because we now hold an equity stake in your business. It incentivizes the mentors because they now hold an equity stake in your business, so to, you know, to keep involved after graduation. But what's really cool about it is it really incentivizes your cohort to stay together, because now you all have you're literally invested in one another's success. And one of the things I've heard from a lot of graduates is that, you know, a few months after, they go, you know, I'm so glad for that component, the share among the cohort, because it really maintains that cohesiveness, you know. That's definitely something that we really want to foster. So one of the priorities I know that HQ's been talking about, it's certainly a priority for myself, is improving our ability over the course of this next year or two to really maintain the FI network globally for our alumni, for our alumni, for our mentors, for investors, so that you know, it's because you look at accelerators like Techstars, for example, and they've got an entire, you know, platform for networking, right? You create an account once you graduate, you sign into it, you can access all kinds of resources. And we don't have anything quite as formal yet. It's more informal. So starting to build that out, I think, is going to be one of the top priorities going forward. So that's a ton of value.
And we both know Robert Wright, I believe, right?
Yeah.
And do you know Candace Dykes? She come to us, Give Space. She have Founder Institute.
Oh, Candace. Yeah. I know Candace really well. Yeah, she's wonderful.
So I know them.
The other day,
so I never went through the institute, Founder Institute, but they went through. I know people went through, and basically all said the same thing. Like, it's not a joke, right? Like, you can't be mentally weak. You gotta come your shit together, right?
Yeah.
Like, of course, not gonna be rude or unprofessional, but if your pitch is like kind of bad, you're gonna be told it's kind of bad, right? So it's not for the weak-minded, right? Can you talk about that somehow? Like, you actually tell people, no, maybe this isn't for you, and I think a lot of people need to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a fine tightrope to walk, right? We don't want to. We're never gonna like kick someone out for not having a great pitch or something. If they're not doing the work, we're gonna have a chat with them, right? If you don't complete the assignments and everything, you're not going to be allowed to graduate. It really wouldn't be fair to the founders who did put in the work, right? And also means you're not getting anything out of the program. But if someone's really putting in the effort and they're trying, we're going to bend over backwards to support them. I mean, Jeremy, my colleague, and myself, and Lainey, my other colleague helping run this chapter, we all have stories of 2-hour calls with founders, being up till 10 o'clock at night, helping someone go over their pitch again and again because they're going to be talking to an investor tomorrow, right? Like, it's very much a labor of love, right? And we really,
And this is not, so people know, this is not your full-time job. This is like your volunteer,
no, this
like
is
this,
for
like,
fun.
yeah.
So there is a small stipend associated to the local leaders. I should forget what it comes out to for the entire 14-week term. It's not why you're doing it. But it really is for fun. And of course the equity stake is like, these are such early stage companies. The majority are going to go through so many iterations. They might not be the same company. Many of them, the founders say, and this is actually what I was referencing about the tightrope walk. We're getting founders in at such an early stage that a lot of these founders, they're really using FI, and we encourage this, to decide if this is even the right path for them right now. So what we don't want to do is make it difficult for someone to leave the program, right? If you get a few weeks in and you go, you know what, I can't balance these requirements. This is a lot of intensity. Many founders will say, I still want to do this, but now is not the right time for me. I just had a kid or whatever. I just started a new job. I thought I could do both, but now I'm feeling it's not right. A few cases will have founders go, you know what, my idea is not good. I'm going to go back and rework it, come back later. But in any of those cases, we want to make it super easy. And so typically what we do, there's a very generous refund there's $1,000 course fee, $800 if they sign up early. And like I said, lots of fellowships and whatnot available. There's several weeks in, you can still get a full refund if you leave. And even after that, at any point, if you leave, even if you don't get a refund, you don't have to pay to re-enroll in the future. So we really want to make it very, very easy for people to drop out if they feel it's not right for them. And you see this in the cohorts. Like, we'll typically start with 20, 24 people and maybe see six startups graduate. That's a pretty successful term for us. And that's really to be expected. They're all very, very early stage. So at the same time, we want people to feel supported and encouraged, and we want them to stay in the program, right? We just don't want to make it difficult for them to leave if they decide it's not right for them.
So average cohort starts with 25, ended with 6. The 19 leave, are they like self-selected leave, or you tell them you might want to leave? How's that work?
I've been doing this, I think 3-4 years now. I have not had a single founder that we've pushed out ever. We'll occasionally have to send a slightly strongly worded note to say, hey, you've got 3 weeks of homework overdue, and if you don't get it together, we can't graduate you. We had a couple of those, but we've never actually, had to tell someone they can, or at least not since I've been here. We've never told someone that.
So Levi, when someone graduates, what's the benefit of someone graduating? What's the advantage of that?
So, like I mentioned, we've got networks of investors and advisors and whatnot. So that having successfully completed an FI chapter, an FI program, I should say, is definitely feathering your cap. It adds some legitimacy. There's also the benefit that going through the entirety of the program means that you've developed strong relationships with a lot of mentors. In many cases, many of those mentors become the first members of your advisory board. Like I said earlier, at the end of every cohort, I have a couple startups that will ask me to join an advisory board if we clicked really well. So that's really powerful. You now have access to the FI network, even though it's not as formalized as some of the other accelerators, like I was mentioning. It still is something that exists, and there are resources available, to take advantage of that. We also have now FI has sort of hived off a separate organization to run a very similar program for launching new venture capital funds. And so, of course, there's an obvious, relationship and synergy there. So you gain access to a lot of those folks too.
And is that the loyal VC?
A loyal VC is a separate thing.
Separate thing. Okay, we'll talk about that later then.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk about loyal as well. But loyal would be a great example of part of that network that you do gain access to. And loyal, because of their model, and this is their decision, they're not they're not affiliated at like a corporate level with FI. It's purely sort of a partnership thing. But their primary deal flow is coming from FI. So as a graduate, you now become eligible for their fund, for example, according to their own policies. So a lot of benefits in that respect, I would say. And then of course there's other programs that FI offers. There's the funding lab, for example, which is I think it's a 1-week program. I've heard from a lot of people that it's incredibly intense. But that's for folks, getting ready to kind of start seeking institutional funding to as a kind of a boot camp to get them ready for that. So there's different resources like that that are available. But I would say ultimately, the core benefit really ought to be the learning that you get out of the program itself, and really everything else is kind of coming after that.
And you'll actually type application for next cohort pretty soon, aren't you?
Yeah, I think applications are open now. We're actually starting to run recruiting events already. We have March 30th. We have an event coming up, and I think we have another one April 16th. I want to say. You can go to fi.co. Just make sure your location's set to Seattle in the upper right-hand corner, and you can see all the events coming up. And then my colleagues Jeremy, Laney, and myself, share it on LinkedIn all the time as well. Yeah, the March 30th one coming up, I think promises to be pretty good. We're going to have some investors and founders on the panel, sharing some advice about their own experiences and advice for new founders.
So in the past, how many average applications have you had per cohort?
Gosh, in terms of overall applications, honestly, it varies really wildly. It's hard to say average because of COVID kind of throwing a wrench in the works. Because like for some of the cohorts, as they were virtual, we were admitting anyone from around the world. So obviously that expands your pool. So definitely in the neighborhood of a few dozen applications at a minimum, I would say. And then typically we see around, like I said earlier, maybe 20-ish founders accepted into a cohort. And then just because, Jeremy, Laney, myself are the three on the local team here, we don't like to go too much bigger than that because
It's y'all three to decide who gets in, so to speak.
It's in close partnership with HQ. So the process is run through FIHQ as well. So we have they'll develop an opinion and they'll do like a first screen. There's a whole application process and like a personality test that the founders will take. And so there's certain things there that can just immediately kind of red flag and people get filtered out right off the bat. And then after that, that's the point. Once that first sort of force filter has happened, that's usually when we come in as a local team and start to kind of have more of a direct involvement in the application or the admissions process.
Yes, and then so your early stage, is there like a sweet spot? Like there's like a perfect startup, like they have a certain amount of traction, certain amount of technical skills. Like there's like some kind of sweet spot that you're looking for.
I'd say we're more looking to make sure the startup isn't too mature, to be honest. Because there is a certain point, where, and those folks will usually churn out, but ultimately it kind of, they're kind of walking away going, oh, this is a waste of our time if that happens, right? Yeah. So we really want to avoid that happening. That's the biggest thing. There isn't really such a thing as too early, right? Like I said earlier, and this is very true, we typically, any cohort, we have at least a couple people coming in that they're literally like, I have not quit my job, I do not have a corporation set up, I have an idea and I want to see how this goes, right? And that's it. And that's great, right? We welcome that. In the past couple of years, we've developed two different tracks. There's the growth track and the, oh gosh, I can't remember what the other one's called. But basically the idea is that one track, founders enrolled in one track, they get, the assignments are slightly tweaked and it's really more for startups that are like absolute starting from zero. And then the other track is really more for startups that are, have started to do a little bit, started to make an effort, maybe done some customer discovery, maybe they even have a beta of their product, whatever. And they're really thinking more about, kind of step two, so to speak. Anyone past that point, we're probably going to be referring to them to another accelerator that's more suitable for where they're at. I will say that, coming in, you definitely want to come in with some expectation of the workload that's going to be required and be prepared to dedicate the time.
I think on the website said 20 hours a week minimum, I think, what it said.
I think that's probably the estimate. If it might even be more, right? Depending on, we've had some founders, for example, who will come in and maybe they just really are uncomfortable pitching or have no experience doing it. Or in many cases, maybe that's not the issue, but what they're trying to pitch is so different, unusual, and complex that their pitch just requires a ton of work. And those folks, I strongly suspect, put in quite a lot more than 20 hours a week in practice. And often you'll see the really dedicated founders. They'll be setting up time every week with me, with Jeremy, with Laney, with our mentors, practicing that pitch over and over again. I love working with those founders. The founders who come in and they're just struggling with the pitch, but they really have the drive. Some of my favorite founders to work with because you watch as they just blossom. We had one, I don't want to name names because I don't have permission, but we had a founder last cohort who was coming in and not based in Seattle. And they had such a fascinating business model, I thought, kind of involved in the social impact investment sector. And it was very complex. It was hard to land. And this individual had, just really good like presence, with the presentation, but once they got over their nerves, and a really good sort of prioritization of narrative structure in the pitch. But they were just really struggling to land the important bits in a way that was clear and concise, right? And I felt so bad because, they'd come in, they'd pitch to the mentors would say, oh, you should do ABC. And then they come in next week, pitch to the next set of mentors. And those mentors would give contradicting advice, right? And they were trying to find this middle ground. And I'll tell you what, by the time we got to the end of the cohort, this person's pitch was one of the best pitches I think I've ever seen. I was getting slightly emotional at the end. I was like, how far you've come, It was just fantastic to watch. And it's so cool because, and I'm focusing on pitches just because that's a huge part of the program. And at this very early stage, I think it's helpful for a lot to revolve around the pitch because you're trying to get people on board, whether those are investors, employees, whomever, but also getting a really good, clear, concise pitch. It helps. It's got a sort of knock-on effect, right? Where it helps the person think about what they need to prioritize. If their go-to-market strategy and their pitch is unclear, doesn't make sense, and they're getting critique about it, and they're communicating it clearly, that's a good sign their go-to-market strategy needs some work. It's not the pitch's fault. It's, that they need work there. So it gives them a sense of what to prioritize and what to work on. So I think that's really helpful. But getting the pitch nailed early on, and I'm seeing this now as a co-founder of my own startup, it's so critical. It's so important. So it's really gratifying. We see over and over again that our graduates, in the Seattle area where I have firsthand experience because I'm active in some investor groups here too, they come in and they win pitch competitions. They come first in different investment events where pitches are being evaluated. They get really positive feedback just really consistently. You can see where the practice pays off. And that leads to future successes down the road, right? It's a really good foundation to start things off on.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that pitch decks and resume is kind of the same, right? If you give your resume to 25 people, you got 25 opinions. Give your pitch deck to 20 people, you're gonna get 25 different opinions, I think.
And that's one of the values, right? Because your average founder getting those opinions is super valuable. You want those opinions from many different people, and ideally people that are not friends and family who kind of feel obligated to be nice, right? And we've got some mentors who I can tell you firsthand, they're there to help, but they do not feel obligated to be nice. And, that's a good mix to have. You don't need anyone who's going to be rude or mean or anything. I'm not saying that, but just folks who can go, hey, that didn't make sense. Like there's no other way for me to put that. It didn't make sense. And here's what I think you need to do to try and make this make sense, right? I posted on LinkedIn a while back and had some really great conversations with folks about one of our mentors, Raj Mavad, who does this thing that I really love. When
I saw that.
Yeah, founder will give a pitch and you're kind of sitting there going, oh, I didn't get that. Was it just me? And Raj will go, so-and-so in the audience, tell me what they
Hey, Levi, scoot up a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
He'll pick someone random in the audience and they'll say, can you tell me what their product is about? And it's not, it's not meant to be antagonistic.
It's not like a gotcha, catchy, or...
Yeah, it's not a gotcha. He's just illustrating the point, right? Because he can say, I didn't understand that, but he'll pick someone else and they'll go, oh, well, I get this is their audience and they're trying to solve this problem. And he'll go, okay, and how are they going to do that? And they'll go, oh, I don't really know. And then he'll go back to the founder and he'll say, okay, so you see, those are the points you landed. These are the points you didn't, right? And here's my opinion on why that happened and how you can correct it. And I always find, I think it's such a wonderfully constructive and non-antagonistic, non-aggressive way to land that point in a really clear, 9 times out of 10, the founder will go, you can see them. They go, oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. It just really lands it. And that founder will come back next week. Your pitch will be so much better.
Yeah.
Like, really consistently. So I'm, that kind of thing and those kinds of insights. And then again, talking about my own personal learnings, right? I walk away from that. I go, wow, that was a really cool idea, Raj had. You know what I mean? I'm stealing that. I'm going to go do that now. Do it with my own pitches, So
here's a question for you. Let's suppose you have one slot left in FI. You have 2 companies.
Yeah.
They're pretty much both at the same level, right? Same metrics, same whatever. But one company has been working on it for 3 years. Other one has only been doing it for 3 months. Does one have an advantage over the one based on time, work done, or anything like that?
That's an interesting point. I think what I'd have to get into, my knee-jerk response would be I'm kind of leaning towards the 3-month one. But I'd want to understand a little bit better because we've got a lot, where I'll talk to that one that's been working on it for 3 years, and it's because it started off as a side project, no intent to move it into a startup.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this person is a really common one. You might have a founder who took time off to take care of a new child.
Yeah, or
right?
a family emergency, or something came up, or
illness.
dad spent money on something unforeseen.
Exactly. So they've been working on this side project, right? And now they're at a point where maybe life circumstances have changed, or their priorities have changed. Something's happened where they go, or maybe they're just going, holy crap, I'm getting way more traction on this than I thought. And when you know what, I'm gonna try and make this a real startup. That's a great narrative.
And then even though like I'm a big thing, like if your spouse doesn't support you, it's a hard thing too. So maybe the 3-year person, his spouse like, no, you can't work full time. You got to keep a job until this point too. You know?
That's absolutely something you can see too. Yeah, so there's tons of stuff like that. Or in some cases, what you see is it was a side project, and now the person did have a child and decided, you know what, I'm going to step back from my career, take care of this child. But as a result, I actually have now this time. A startup can fit into it because their time is now sporadically available. They can't commit an 8 or 10 hour block to a day job and also take care of their baby, but they can commit those 8 hours broken out over the course of the day on their own time.
Yeah.
And so they want to do a startup. Like, to me, that's fantastic. I think that's super cool. So I think it really depends on the circumstances. Now, at the same time, you have founders who they'll come in and maybe they're just not as committed to it, right? This is a passion project. They're doing something for fun, but it's at a point where they've done 10 hours a week on it for 3 years, and you get to talk with them, and they're really not going to do more than 10 hours for the next 3 years either. FI is probably not the right place for that person, right? Or an accelerator in general might not be the right place for that person, right? This is really for something for people who want to dive into this full time.
Yeah. Another point, so like maybe the 3-month, team, they have the tech co-founder, they're all connected. They know people in the startups. For the 3-year one, he had to learn code himself. He had
That's a great point.
He had to learn the code himself, all that kind of stuff,
Exactly. So if I've got that 3-month person coming in and they're going, oh, well, I'm friends with this guy with a family office. They dropped 4 million in and we're just off to the races and running. Okay, cool. And maybe I talk to that 3-year person and they go, I'm a college dropout. I've been building my career in tech, scrounging up enough money to do this on the side. And I finally saved up enough that I can commit full time. Oh, I'm taking that person. Like, that is grit. That's grit on grit, right? That's what I want to see, that level of perseverance and determination. Not any kind of a knock against the person in the 3-month position. But if I have to pick between those two people, the person who's proven that they're sticking with us despite hardship and despite challenge for that long, that's someone I want to get to know better. And that's someone I want in the group, right?
So Levi, let's switch to angel investing that you do in the area and just like Seattle fundraising in general.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I should caveat this. I just started investing myself, less than 2 years ago. I made the accredited investor qualification by the skin of my teeth, and I'm not writing any big checks here. So Seattle Angel Conference has been a godsend for me from that point of view, because the buy-in as a participant is very small and it's very structured, right? I think it's a super cool program. I was actually just talking with someone recently. I think it was an investor in San Francisco, actually. And they were talking about how in the past few years, there's been such a ballooning of the Seattle startup ecosystem and investment ecosystem. And I genuinely think a lot of that is probably down to the Seattle Angel Conference, right? Because this is a program that's just churning out investors and helping startups understand how to bring a higher level of professionalism.
I definitely think COVID helped that out too. Kind of John went like virtual, so to speak. I think a couple years ago, Jerry Yin from the Vice Analytics one from San Diego.
That was my first.
That would never happen before. So I think that was a really big help.
Yeah. So that was my first Seattle Angel Conference, was the one with Advice Analytics. And it's fantastic, right? Because you gain, as an investor, or an aspiring investor, you learn so much going through that program, right? You get to watch the do's and don'ts of due diligence and understand what people look for. And it's super helpful for the entrepreneurs too, both the entrepreneurs going through the startup or through the program, but even if you're entering the program as an investor, it's helpful for you as a founder as well, because you get to see the discussion that happens between the investors, right? And you also get to see some of the differences between the new investors and the more experienced investors, right? And the different ways they think about things. So I think there's a huge advantage there. I also really like it because, a lot of founders will tell you, this is kind of a joke, that the smaller the check an investor's bringing, the more of a pain in the ass they're going to be for you.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot.
I think it can often be true. And I strongly suspect that there's a correlation, because if it's a smaller check, it's someone who can't afford as much. So they're a little more precious about their money. And also there's a good chance they're a less experienced investor and they're going to be a little bit more paranoid and maybe have an overinflated idea of their own value. Just hypothesizing here, definitely not based on personal experience. But with the Seattle Angel Conference, I think it's really better for the founders, because as investors, we're all sort of corralled, and good behavior is enforced by John and the other organizers, which I think is really good. So there's a lot of value there, and then there's that assurance that you're going to get a wealth of feedback from the experience as a founder who's participating too, which is really nice because you often see, you talk to VCs or angel groups and they just come back and they go, we don't want to invest. Why not? It's just radio silence, right? So you don't really have a chance to improve or grow from that.
So what's your opinion on this? So you hear a lot of founders in Seattle say, I've been trying to get investment. I can't get any money from any VCs or angels. The angels and VCs, while we invest in companies that are, VC backed or whatever, then a lot of these founders will go like the Bay Area, Austin, New York City and get investment after the case. It seems like there's a disconnect there.
Yeah, I think it speaks to our ecosystem here for investment. And I have to admit that, the startup, my startup Eunimart, so, I joined as sort of a late co-founder. And the startup is headquartered in LA, was originally founded, and the majority of the team still sits in Hyderabad in India. So we actually do not have very many investors at all from the Seattle area. So I have not had the benefit of experiencing the ecosystem here to any great extent as a founder, only to a minimal degree. My sense is that, you've got a lot of people in the space here who are, coming out of Microsoft, Amazon, what have you. They're very focused on cloud technology, B2B SaaS, AI is a big one. They often have some fairly fixed ideas, I think, about what is or is not feasible in those spaces. And I'm not personally, as a non-technical person myself, I'm not personally convinced that some of those sort of shibboleths are always entirely accurate. I think sometimes they're more limiting than they are beneficial, which can be problematic when it comes to innovation, right? You've got a really creative founder in one of the spaces, and you'll have a lot of people who are experts in those or similar spaces saying, oh no, this isn't feasible or this isn't possible, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Then that same founder might go down to San Francisco or Austin or off to the East Coast or something and find investors willing to give them a shot, get off to the races and running, and turns out, what, actually it was possible, right? Actually have a startup in FI grab that I strongly suspect is on track to fall into exactly that category with an AI-based product right now. So that can be a little bit limiting. It's just like how founders will tell you, in LA, for example, the ecosystem is very focused around D2C brands, e-commerce, consumer tech. New York, you see a lot of media and ad tech. Boston, you see a lot of, health and biotech.
New York, fintech.
Yeah, fintech in New York as well. You're right. Now, that's not to say that, you're not going to see, an e-commerce SaaS company starting and getting funded and being successful in New York, or a health tech, biotech company getting funded successfully in San Francisco. These are just kind of general trends that I think most people would agree are present. So that's important as well. The other big thing I think you see in Seattle is our scene is much younger, right? So I don't know the stats on it, but I strongly suspect you'd see that the average age of our VC funds here, the average size too, is significantly younger, significantly smaller.
Yeah, and plus I think for every one Seattle VC, there's like at least 50 in the Bay Area or some crazy number like that.
True, yeah. So there's also just a numbers issue for sure. But if you're a micro VC with a $20 million pre-seed fund, you're going to be very circumspect, right? You're going to be very cautious, and the checks you're writing, a company is probably going to need several of those checks to really get moving. You go to a larger ecosystem. I mean, look, if 0.1% of the investors out there are right for you, that might be 3 investors in Seattle and 20 investors in San Francisco, right? I'm just making up numbers, obviously, but it's just if there's a small slice that's suitable for you, then a bigger pie means a bigger slice, right? So I strongly suspect that's probably a big part.
Yeah, so I know a guy in the Bay Area. I can't think of his name to credit him, but we were talking about this one time, comparing Bay Area to Seattle.
Yeah.
His opinion was like in the Bay Area, all the investors have at least started a company before, like at least started one startup, right? At least once, a deal. He like, it's like most people in Seattle, like Amazon, Microsoft, that knew how to read a startup. He said the second part is the bigger deal is like in the Bay Area, someone says quote unquote makes it right. They sell $100 million. They always reinvest the money back in the Bay Area startups. He's like, I don't know if like Seattle startups do that once they quote unquote make it, or they really reinvesting back in the community,
That's a really interesting point. My guess, and this is just a guess, is that historically that probably has not been true to the same extent as in San Francisco, and I think that's changing in the past few years. Again, just a guess. Just based on my exposure to the ecosystem and what I'm seeing. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Or rather, it's a positive flywheel, right? You have more investors, more investment money being reinvested in the space. you're going to have more successful startups, right?
Yeah.
Launching, which means more investors going forward, and you create a really a virtuous cycle there. Ideally, I think this is maybe my own optimism coming through, but I think that we're in sort of, let's say, stage 2 of 4 of a cycle like that right now. I think in Seattle, I mean.
I think another challenge too for startup founders, like you come to might be worth 12 million in San Francisco, but 6 million in Seattle, maybe 8 million in Austin. Like every location you go is like a different valuation you have to do.
Yeah, that can be challenging, and you've got. I think we're going to start seeing. I don't think we're quite seeing it yet, but we're going to start seeing some increasing ramifications of this turn towards remote work affecting that. I strongly suspect. But to some extent, it's driven, I think, by supply and demand in terms of where the supply is deal flow, new investment opportunities, right? And the demand, of course, is those investment dollars or paid for by those investment dollars. So I think where you have greater demand for that deal flow, you are going to see higher prices, right? Pretty simple market economics. I mean, there's obviously more to it than that, but I do think that's one of the factors that goes into it.
Yeah, I'm totally making this up, but sometimes like the Seattle investors expect the A-round company for pre-seed investment sometimes.
What do you mean?
Like, if you're going to get a pre-seed investment, yeah, but then when you have A-round metrics, right?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think something like that is probably akin. Yeah, and you see this among newer investors. I think is this risk aversion that leads them to want.
Yeah, are you an investor or you're a small business banker?
Exactly. Yeah, you see this like I've had experiences where we'll have a company pitching to some investors, and the feedback afterwards will be, well, they don't have any revenue yet, so I don't feel comfortable investing. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the stage you're at, right? Like there is a stage at which the company isn't going to have revenue, and you need to be comfortable with that risk, and that's why you're going to get way more equity in the company for your dollar than you would if you invested after they have revenue, because you're adopting that risk. That's how it works. So if you're not comfortable with that level of risk, that's fine. This investment stage is not right for you, right? But it's not fair to the company to call yourself, an early stage or pre-seed investor, right? And then have requirements that that company needs to meet to be investable that are really more appropriate for a seed stage or even a Series A company, right? That's a mismatch. You're not going to find the companies you're looking for at that stage. And that's what I mean about educating investors and ensuring that they know what they're doing and know how to interact with the startups and how to evaluate the startups at some level.
Yeah, I know I was Bunko last like 2.5 years. I run the reservation program. It's based like via FI for military veterans.
Oh, cool.
And I want to say like we had like 10 members per cohort. At least one member got funded each time. None of them got funded in Seattle. Hopefully I'm not wrong, but I know like one guy got angel investment from Atlanta, another from there. All of them, I can't think of one that got invested from Seattle, even though of course they tried hard to get here. They always went somewhere else. The ones who got funded always went somewhere else.
Wow.
I think another challenge I talk to people about, like, you're a founder, you're in Seattle, you get your no, and you think that's it, right? Like maybe you went to somewhere else, you would have got funded,
Yeah.
Like how many people give up? Well, Seattle told me no, I can't get funded. That's it, right?
It's incredible the differences, just region to region in terms of investment. And I've seen this with Eunimart. Some of our investors are in the U.S. We've got investors based outside the U.S. and we've got investors in India. So outside the U.S. is in not India, as well as the investors in India. And just watching the cultural differences in terms of what those investors are looking for, what they're worried about, what they'll take as sort of proof of traction or proof of success is wild between countries. And one of the things that's super interesting to see is how the investors who have a presence in India value highly our substantial traction, Unimart's substantial traction in India. Investors based in US, they'll literally say to our face, that they don't want to invest until we have traction. Like the fact that we have several hundred paying customers and tens of thousands in monthly recurring revenue coming out of India, it's like they forget it exists.
That's like monopoly money.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Now, I completely get the argument, right, that they want to see product market fit established in the US and real traction here. It's just interesting in the language that there's no qualifier in the statement, right? They'll just say, oh, I want to see traction, not I need to see traction in the US, right? And it's just an interesting difference, I think, of perspective. And then you similarly, you'll see with a lot of these VC funds that, they often say, oh, these are our parameters. We look for companies at this stage. These are our check sizes. This is the amount of equity we want, and they'll have a lot of different requirements for what they look for. And I would say, maybe 80% of the time, you really think about it, and those requirements, those differentiators in strategy, um, between funds, they're really not all it's really doing is narrowing down the deal flow, right?
Mhm.
But it's a little bit like if you said, hey, I'm going to go on a diet and I'm not going to eat any foods that are red, right? Yeah, it's going to reduce what's available to you. It's going to limit your choices, which can often be easier. But there's no real connection to, any kind of nutritional aspect, right? If you're removing foods by, say, color or by shape or what have you. And I feel like it's kind of similar to that with a lot of VCs. They have, restrictions that they'll put on the kinds of funds or the kinds of investment opportunities they're looking for, but it doesn't really have any impact on potential success or anything. It's just the parameters they've chosen to place. Now that said, the other 20%, you see some VCs that really are genuinely doing, and this isn't a criticism, right? There's a model that works. If that's the model you're following, great, more power to you. That's fine. But there's some VCs that are looking at this and going, no, we want to do something different and adopting a really truly different model. And Loyal would be one of those, I would say. Mighty Capital is another really cool one. Overlooked Ventures is one I'm personally very interested in. I don't have a direct connection to them, but these are VC funds. They're all pretty new, usually founded within the past, say, 3 to 4 years, and they're trying out really new, innovative, different models of investment and engagement. And I think that's very exciting. Personally, it's really cool to see.
Yeah, back to diversity real fast. You'll see, like I see it all the time. Like these VC will say, we want to invest in diverse, whatever case may be.
Yeah,
And the small note, we only do email introductions from people where you know.
exactly.
Like
Right. And
what?
that kind of
Are you
stuff.
are you serious right now?
Exactly. And that's a cool thing. Overlooked Ventures does actually. They don't do warm intros. They're not interested. They say if you want to pitch to them, everybody has to go through the same intake process and
Mhm.
application process, right? Because they don't want to create that kind of, bias in their process, which I have a ton of respect for. I think that's really, really impressive. Loyal does sort of takes the opposite approach, right? They say our deal flow comes, they have three ways the deal flow comes in. An FI, the main way is an FI graduate that's recommended by the director of that chapter as a top alum. Second way is other INSEAD alums, because the two GPs are INSEAD alums. And then the third way is if an investor, a limited partner who has more than a certain amount invested in the fund, gets a credit. I think it's a credit for every $100,000 you have invested, something like that. And you can use that credit to recommend one company to be invested in by the fund, and then they'll do their due diligence. And if everything checks out, they'll invest, regardless of whether there's an INSEAD or FI connection. And that's it. And so, obviously, you can look at that and say, well, there's some bias there, right? INSEAD, right off the top of my head. But I think what they do is they're trying to create a sort of an objective structure, right? And it makes it much easier to apply an objective framework to evaluation of a startup for investment, right? It's kind of the other side of the coin from, say, the approach that a company like, or a fund like Overlook Ventures takes. So both of those are very new funds. I don't know about Overlook Ventures numbers to date. I'm not an LP there, but I am an LP with Loyal, and I can say that I think they've been very successful to date. It's been really impressive. I'm very glad to be part of the fund, and I'm really excited to see what the next few years holds with that model.
So a startup. So for this question, I'm not talking about when like a startup reaches out, a founder reaches out to a VC to start networking and build a relationship. But do you think that most founders or startups start the fundraising process way too soon?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I would make that statement, to be honest. I think one thing that I do see among earlier stage founders that I would say when it comes to funding is there's often this belief that they have to seek outside funding. And one of the biggest questions I get from very early stage founders in FI and outside of it is, do I need VC funding, right? And I'll talk to them and I'll say, well, what are you going to use the money for? And a lot of times the answer I get is, oh, I don't really know. We don't really need it. Well,
So
there
you
you go.
probably don't need it. Yeah.
You don't need VC funding. But I think there's just this idea that VC funding is so closely associated with startups that some founders who don't have, exposure to the space previously kind of go, oh, I must be missing something. I have to get VC funding or I'm not a real startup.
Then you hear all the hype, So this company raised $2.5 million or whatever it should be. But I think the stats, I'll make this up again, even with VC funding, only like 10% or even less even make it, Like what's that company last year? I think it was called Quibi, had like $5 million in funding.
Oh, I think it was more than that, actually. Yeah, that
And they failed like in
crazy.
6 months. It's like,
yep. And then they just completely imploded. And that's a great example. I've been talking about that particular company a lot lately. No, it's true. I mean, it's a case of cherry picking your success metrics, right? As a startup, there's so many ways you could look at it because it's so subjective. There's no market cap to evaluate, right? If you're still growing with revenue, you can't really evaluate profits because you're not profitable, right? So do you look at the extent of your loss? That's not really a viable metric either. Maybe you're
Our
just
loss,
reinvesting
our loss
everything.
was less this quarter versus the last quarter.
Yeah, exactly, right? You could look at headcount. Are you growing? Okay, great, but maybe you're hiring irresponsibly. That doesn't really tell me anything. And so, what's become a popular vanity metric is money raised and valuation, right? But those are also like, frankly, I don't care what your money raised or your valuation was. I want to know what your term sheet looks like, right? If I'm going to be investing or considering joining a startup, if you've got a terrible term sheet, if you've got liquidation multiples and you've given up like preferred stock really early on, and you don't have a lot of equity left for the founder or all kinds of stuff, yeah, you might have a several $100 million valuation. You've raised a bunch of money, but your terms suck. You're not going to be walking away with anything as a founder. I had an experience when I was at ESADE. I had this really good class. It was called Entrepreneurial Finance, taught by Dr. Luisa Alemani, who's in charge of an entrepreneurial uh, 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 not program, but a new institute at I think it's at London Business School actually. And she published a book a year or two ago on entrepreneurial finance in Europe. That's really, really a fantastic read as well. Um, and she gave us this example in the class where she laid out, what looked like a really great fundraise for a startup. And then she had a hypothetical term sheet, which admittedly was probably a lot worse than you would see in real life, but it was definitely within the bounds of possibility. And then she ran the numbers, like walked us through the numbers of in the event of what would by any standard be a very successful exit for this hypothetical startup, based on the term sheet in the last funding round, here's how the equity distribution would break down. And what it broke down to was for a startup that sold at something like, $500 million, and the founder was walking away with double-digit equity percent. And then it ultimately worked out that the founder left with like 10 grand, something like that, right? Like almost no money at all. And she was just showcasing how the different terms, if they were unfavorable to the founder, how it could compound and end up with the founder, even in the case of a like explicitly, like objectively successful exit, the founder walks away with borderline nothing. That really made an impression on me because I had no idea at the time, right? And I think something like that, I often talk with founders about that. They get really hung up on the amount raised and the valuation. I say, look, you've got to pay attention to the term sheet. Familiarize yourself with what's standard practice right now in your area for terms. Make sure you have a lawyer on board. Like, be prepared going in, know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and get familiar with this. There are resources out there, but if you're in the middle of a negotiation with a VC fund and you've got a week to decide, it is not enough time to ramp yourself up to the level that you need if you don't already have a good lawyer helping you.
That's one of the many things the entrepreneur has to get smart on, right?
It is, yeah. You have to be an expert in so many spaces. It's dizzying, right? And I think one of the things that a founder needs to be capable of, and this is a skill that I am still attempting to master, is recognizing when you kind of have to apply the Pareto principle, I feel like, to your level of expertise, right? What is the 20% of knowledge that you can get that gives you 80% of the benefit, so to speak? You have to get comfortable with this idea that something needs to be good enough, and you have to develop the skill, or I think it's very beneficial to develop the skill of being able to dive into a new topic, prioritize exactly the elements of that topic you need to understand, like investing in startups, for example, right? As a founder, you don't really need to understand how to do due diligence, even though that would be considered a foundational kind of flagstone of learning how startup investment works. But that's not what's important to you right now. You need to understand how VCs are evaluating you, how the term sheet works, how the investment process works, what the terminology is. It's really important to know the language. There's a ton of jargon. The concepts behind that jargon are not complicated, but if you don't know the jargon, you come across as ignorant, right? And you don't want to come across as ignorant. So it's really good to get up to speed on the jargon of the startup investment community for that exact reason. And so really being able to kind of, go really deep on particular sort of subtopics within a subject, get the information you need, pull back out and apply it is a very critical skill, I think, as a founder. Like I said, one I'm still working on, but
Yes. So next, let's talk about your startup on now. So,
Yeah.
so first, I have is this. So the company started in 2017, I think.
Yeah.
But you just joined as a co-founder.
Correct.
I think a lot of people think you're only a co-founder if you join like within the first 2 or 3 months.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk about how that's really a myth, and anyone become a co-founder?
Yeah, definitely. I think at this point, co-founder is really it is indicative of your role within the company, right? And so the intent is to imply that you're at a kind of a foundational level in terms of your responsibility for ensuring that the company continues to exist. And I think what's really important there is to understand that you can be a co-founder without necessarily being a C-suite executive in the startup, right? It is entirely possible as our company grows that I may find myself in a position where, we want to bring in an expert CMO, for example, to lead the company, and that might be someone I work with, but I'm not in a C-suite role with that person because if we're fortunate enough, maybe we land someone who's really got substantial expertise and accomplishments in that space, and that's the person that we want to lead our marketing strategy, right? Absolutely a possibility. And then, there's this idea of the late co-founder as well, which is how I've described my position with respect to Unimart. It's something I came across not long ago, and I thought that was a clever term. I don't know if it's an official term or not, but I think it's a good description. And I think this is something you often see more when the startup has had a major shift of some kind. You see this with something like Tesla, for example. People often refer to Elon Musk as the founder of Tesla. That's actually not true. He came in significantly later. The original, I think, two co-founders left the company, I want to say on good terms, but don't quote me on that. And Musk took over and transformed it into the Tesla that we know today. And so I think by any reasonable assessment, you'd have to call him a co-founder for that reason. But he wasn't there at the initiation of the company. He joined later. Very similar situation with Uber and Travis Kalanick, for example. Same deal. I think if you dig into a lot of larger successful tech firms, you'll actually find this is frequently the case. In our case, Unimart started in 2017, as you mentioned, and it originally was more service oriented while the product platform was being built out, because the platform that we're leveraging is very complex, very big project. So the idea was to start generating some revenues and proof of concept of the idea before the product was necessarily ready. And then just about when the product was going to be launched, COVID really threw a wrench in the works. Commercial lockdowns in India were significantly more stringent than they were in the US, which really just shut down e-commerce, basically, food and medicine, and that was all you could buy for several months. So launch of the platform was delayed until late 2020, didn't really take off until early 2021. And at that point, it was becoming really clear that sort of an overhaul of the company structure was needed. There was a lot that wasn't working. The company was running out of money. Things were getting pretty grim. And so the co-founders who were there at the time, went through a complete overhaul, changed everything, and by the middle of the year, it was essentially a new company, massive headcount turnover, massive changes. At that point, they decided to execute what had always been the long-term plan and move to the US. They did that by enrolling in Techstars Accelerator in LA, and then immediately began looking for a US-based co-founder to help lead the expansion in the US. And that was where I came in. So I was an LP with Loyal already at that time. Loyal VC was one of the early institutional investors in Unimart. And so Kamal, the GP there, put me in touch with Unimart. He felt that I'd be a good match for what they were looking for. I had a chat with Shaikh Mazumdar, our CEO. We agreed that it looked like a good match. I started working with them informally over the summer last year, and then formally joined in early October. And given that the company had just re-domiciled to the US, it's essentially a totally new initiative out here. It had just gone through a reinvention. In a lot of ways, it feels like joining a startup that really is just maybe a year old, So it's been really, really exciting from that point of view. But at the same time, I've got a wealth of resources that you would not typically see at a startup that was actually a year old. So from my point of view, it's really an incredible combination of the best of two worlds that I really could not have reasonably expected when I started my search for the opportunity.
Levi, can you talk some about the challenges or maybe the advantages of having a company in the United States and India?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's huge economic benefits, right? We have this presence here, so we're able to raise money from, North American and European investors like Loyal VC. They're based in Toronto, and we're able to raise that money, at valuations and in amounts that is reflective of, US-based startup. At the same time, we've got a fantastic tech team based in India. We pride ourselves on paying well, but it's still India. Cost of living, salaries are significantly lower. So that's why we're able to be at a situation where just now, in the middle of our seed raise, and we've got a team of 90 people sitting in Hyderabad, right? So the huge advantage from that point of view. I would also say, it gives us access to multiple different markets, right? We were able to build out this presence. Like I said, we've got a really substantial user base already in India, through the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And as a startup, where our focus at every level is international. We have an international team. We're trying to help companies go cross-border and sell internationally as profitably, simply, and effectively as possible, which is really critical. And so being able to kind of live that at every level of the company and be a truly international company as well, I think is hugely advantageous, right? Having a presence in the US, for example, means that we can add a lot more value to our sellers in India who want to come to the US. We're way better equipped to help them move here. Sellers in the US who want to move to Southeast Asia and India, same deal. As we grow, we'll set up teams in Latin America and Europe for exactly the same reason, right? So I think from that perspective, there's a lot of advantage too, right? We just have this much bigger footprint and access to resources across both regions.
So Levi, this can be like a multi-part question. Some of this already answered, but like, what exactly is it that your company does? Like how it got started, the idea, what you focus on now, and what's the vision for the company moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great, it's a big question. You might need to remind me of the second parts. So as far as what we're focused on now, so like I said earlier, we're an e-commerce enablement platform. So we're working with e-commerce sellers and trying to help them move towards omni-channel retail, right? So branching out into new marketplaces, new channels of sale, and at the same time also help them to move cross-border. So we're really trying to catch the wave on two major trends. Well, I should say three major trends right now. One, COVID has accelerated a trend that already existed, which is this move to e-commerce. So we're looking at more than half of retail dollars going through e-commerce probably by 2025 or 2026. Similarly, within e-commerce, we're seeing a massive shift towards cross-border. So meaning consumer level fulfillment. So we're not talking like full container loads or pallet shipments, but individual packages being shipped across national borders to customers. And those might be products that are stored in warehouses in local environments, or they might actually be getting shipped direct to fulfillment or drop shipped to customers internationally. And then the third trend, and that again, that's on track now to be cross-border, to be more than half of all e-commerce sales, but in terms of dollars by within the next 4 years, probably less. And then the third trend is omni-channel retail. And this is basically the concept that increasingly brands today are selling across many different channels of sales. So they're not just selling through retail or through their own stores, they're also selling through their own websites, and they're selling on e-commerce marketplaces. They might be selling through partnerships. In some cases, they might be selling through different types of like subscription boxes, things like that. Many different patterns. And the sort of the gold standard here is to be able to build relationships with your customers that are persistent across those different channels, right? So that you can have the same experience for any customer, regardless of what channel they're interacting with you on, right? You can give a customer a great experience, even if they're, they're purchasing from you or interacting with you through multiple channels, and that experience is always going to be consistent. And that can be on a technical level and back end surprisingly difficult to achieve. And a lot of the problem here is a lot of the different software that's available doesn't play well together. You've got a lot of legacy software in the physical retail and legacy distribution space, and a lot of newer platforms and services in the e-commerce, marketplace and web store space. And that's ecosystem is changing constantly, right? So what you're seeing with a lot of these brands is what they're having to do is the typical path for a US brand is you launch on Amazon first, right? You've got access to a marketplace. Amazon takes care of all your fulfillment, super easy. Then usually right around the same time, you're probably setting up a Shopify store, right? So you have your own store. Typical next step is you're probably going to look at starting to sell in Canada. It's international, but it's next door. It's very easy. You can often build directly from the US. Depending on your product and where you're at, you might also decide to sell in Mexico. Right about at this point, you're probably going to start to feel the constraints of Amazon. Your cost of selling is going to be quite high. You're realizing that you need to invest pretty heavily in advertising on the platform to be successful. Depending on how big you are, you might be hitting up about $1 million or $2 million in revenue. You're probably starting to feel the pinch from imitators and knockoffs. You're having to spend more on advertising to deal with that. And if the majority of your sales are coming through Amazon, you're probably now at this point getting worried about losing the buy box, about false claims of fraud against your product. This is not an uncommon thing that could result in inaccurate shutdowns of your business for a day or two, which could be catastrophic. Right. So you're going, you know what? I don't want all my eggs in one basket. So now you're thinking about expanding internationally. You're probably going to look at the UK first because they speak English. It's a relatively easy market to reach and it's large. And then you're probably looking at Germany after that because that's going to be one of the biggest e-commerce markets in Europe. Now at this point, you're going, okay, this is getting too complicated. I've got 10 people in my business. We're doing maybe 3 million a year. And I'm needing translation. I need to figure out, I'm moving into the German market, for example. Amazon is nowhere near as big a share of the German e-commerce market as it is in the US. So you're going, well, if I really want the same kind of market exposure, I need to get on some other platforms. But now that means I'm moving out of the FBA ecosystem. I need to find my own warehousing and logistics solutions. I need to manage those other marketplace stores, which means I need to set up product listings and maintain inventory and ensure that everything is aligned across my different marketplaces and web stores. So I'm looking at hiring a person for each of those new web stores, and I'm probably looking at hiring some kind of a small tech team to figure out how to make all the different systems I need to automate play nice together. So all of a sudden, my costs have started to balloon. The complexity has ballooned, and I don't really have a guarantee of revenue coming in to ensure that I'm going to be profitable in a year or two, right? Not a good situation to be in. So what we're trying to do is solve that problem by building this platform to essentially enable that integration all in one place, enable centralized management, and give sellers access to warehousing, logistics, and other ecosystem services that they need in the marketplaces that they're moving to. So sort of like the sort of all-encompassing Amazon experience, but agnostic to the channel that you're on. So that's kind of our near-term goal, is landing some US customers, supporting their growth, demonstrating that we can replicate the same kinds of results we've seen, doubling, tripling revenue within 12 months in India, that we can do that here as well. And as we start to expand there, then the big focus is going to be on building our presence out in new countries, and ideally building some strong partnerships with brand aggregators, marketing agencies, e-commerce agencies, who will be able to see the value in our platform for their customers and be able to leverage it as a value add to their own services.
And what's the vision for the company moving forward? Like, you want to be in every single country, or?
Yes, ideally we'd be global. So this is an area that's really near and dear to my heart. It's one of the things that Shayak and I, our CEO, originally clicked on when we first talked. We both got strong entrepreneurial bents. We both grew up in more rural areas, and saw what it was like trying to start a small business, and saw the differences in your level of success based on the resources you have access to. So something we believe in really, really strongly is the value of democratizing access to these kinds of resources, right? If we could bring the same level of access to resources, whether that's money, technical talent, the marketplaces themselves, shipping, logistics services, whatever it is, to someone who wants to be a seller in, say, rural northern India, for example, as someone living in, say, LA, what kind of landscape change might that make to the e-commerce landscape? What kinds of businesses might we start seeing pop up, and the levels of success and prosperity in some of those communities that right now don't have access to these kinds of services, right? It's taking advantage of the decentralized nature of modern commerce and ensuring equitable access to that in many, many different areas, right? And this is something that we're very, very excited about. It's really important to myself and my co-founders on a personal level, So this is an area that I really believe in, and I'm very excited in particular for our expansion into Latin America, to see what that kind of brings. And because you look at e-commerce initiatives in Latin America, you look at Mercado Libre, for example. I mean, you look at the history of that. They started in 1999, and everybody said this is not an e-commerce marketplace coming out of Brazil, like, not a thing. And now it's a massive company. It's I think it's got a $54 billion market cap last I checked, something like that. Very successful. What other kinds of success stories are there like that to be unlocked given access to resources? And that to me, very exciting. I want to see where we go with that.
So Levi, for lack of a better term, a better word, who's your perfect customer?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so right now, a great customer for us would be someone doing, let's say, roughly 3 to 25 million in revenue, up to maybe 50 million in revenue. Maybe they've already started dabbling in international, exposure on maybe a UK marketplace, German marketplace, something like that. They're getting to the point where they're going, our path to growth internationally and through new marketplaces has been like this, and all of a sudden it's looking like this, right, in terms of cost. And they're going, how do we get around this wall? We need to keep growing. They're probably, they're on Amazon, they're on Shopify, they're maybe on one or two other marketplaces. They want to expand to more marketplaces, but they haven't yet because the headcount requirement just is becoming, the tech requirement is becoming really difficult. And they're at that point where they're poised to expand. They want to expand, but they need a better way to do it. Chances are they're selling something like consumer electronics or fashion products, shoes, jewelry, something like that. something that's got decent margins, relatively easy to ship, shelf stable, and is probably going to have relatively equal appeal in multiple different marketplaces. Um, I'd say that's probably a good description at the moment. As we grow, that ideal customer will get bigger and bigger, hopefully. But that's kind of the market we're looking at right now.
And so what's your method for finding these companies right now?
So right now, we're right at the beginning of working on this. I mean, part of it is just leveraging our networks, connecting with people. I've been doing a lot of customer discovery, trying to understand, what are the pain points for companies like this? What's the language they're using to describe those? What kind of help are they looking for, and how are they looking for it? So that's one aspect, just leveraging networks. We are spinning up, a pretty traditional, straightforward outbound sales program, which is just now starting to yield some results as well. That's been an interesting experience. My background is not in sales, so been learning as I go. One thing I'm very excited about is a content program I'm trying to launch here, and I've actually got a couple interviews set up with some really gracious folks who agreed to talk with me this week. Just looking to connect with experts in e-commerce or in spaces that are relevant to an e-commerce seller, and just chat with them, learn more about their experience, advice that they can share on a particular topic, and then drafting some blog posts, maybe doing video interviews, something like that out of it, just sharing that with our audience. The idea being not to say, hey, go use Unimart, or as an advertising thing or anything, but really just to start adding value to this community and starting these kinds of conversations, building some relationships. I mean, what I'd love to see happen at this point, and fingers crossed it will, is that we start connecting with some smaller brands. They're maybe doing a few $100,000 a year that go, look, you're not right for us right now, but we love your content. We love what you're doing. It's super helpful. And, a year down the road, they go, okay, we're now, we're really successful. We're doing 2 million, and now we need an integrated platform. And you're the guys we want to work with because we already know you. Right. And that's really what I'm hoping to build out here with this content program. And then the last leg is partnerships. We've been having just incredibly good results, just connecting with brand aggregators, marketing services, agencies working with startups, and different types of organizations supporting startups. Like we announced recently a partnership with HSBC Bank, because they have some programs supporting smaller e-commerce sellers, and lending programs and whatnot. So we're working with them as a value add service that they can then provide to those customers to support their growth, right? It's a win-win-win situation for everybody involved. So those kinds of partnerships are super exciting. I'm really hoping to see a lot more develop in that space as well.
Levi, so what percentage of companies in the United States, what percentage is in India, and how y'all deal with like the time zone differences and all that, those challenges?
You mean percentage of our company?
Yeah.
So it's like 90% India, 95% India, 5% US at the moment.
So does the company run off India time or United States time?
Oh boy, sometimes it feels like India time. So right now, it depends on what we're doing. If I'm working on a big marketing project or something, and I'm leveraging resources in India and working with the team there, we're more or less on India time, and I'm pulling some late nights. If I'm doing something more working with like our sales team, that's kind of more locally focused to the US, I get to work more on US time. So it really depends on the project. I anticipate we'll increasingly be moving towards US time as the team here is built out. But some of our functions are as Shayek likes to say, we have global functions like finance, for example. We have a finance team in India. They handle everything for the whole company. And then we have more local functions like sales, right? There's a sales team in India. They're working on the Indian market and surrounding markets. We're building out our sales team now in the US. They'll be focused on the US, right? So, state of flux, really.
So Levi, you're a startup founder, you do stuff for Founders Institute, you're a VC, angel investor. I'm going to presume you have some kind of personal life, all this stuff going on. How do you do your schedule day to day?
So that's a good question. It's basically, I guess there's a few items that kind of get penned in, and they're pretty fixed unless there's something really high priority. So I have been trying to play the cello, let's put it that way, for several years now. So my cello lessons are one of those things, right? If there's something really important that overlaps, I'll cancel it if I have to, or reschedule my lesson. But otherwise, that's me time, right? And one of the things I love about working in the startup is, especially because we've got hours all over the place, I can my cello lesson might be in the middle of the day, which would normally be a work day, but that's fine. I'm working remotely, and I'm probably going to be, I got to call it 8 o'clock at night with our marketing team anyway. So it all kind of balances out. And then there's other stuff that's more sort of on the side. Maybe I've got a mentoring call or something that can easily be rescheduled if it needs to. So I'd say I really just kind of figure out what kind of is fixed. Next week, for example, I'm starting. I discovered that there's an organization here in Seattle that offers blacksmithing classes.
That's interesting.
Right, that's what I thought. I said, that's cool as hell. And honestly, I can't think of anything I'd really that would be a better stress reliever than banging on some metal with a big hammer. So I've wanted to try blacksmithing since I was like 12. So I saw that and I said, hell yeah. So I'm starting that on Monday, for example. That's something that doesn't get rescheduled. So, I work around it. And then, I'm at a point now where I'm trying to find a good balance. I've had in previous jobs, I've really thrown myself full on into the job and everything else kind of got put off. And I'm at a point now where I thought, it's no longer a sprint. It's a marathon. I want to be in this for the long haul. And that means I need to take care of myself. I need to pursue my interests. And I need to not always be in a state of mind where, I'm saying, well, someday I'll get to that. Later, I'll get to that. Right. And I think that's the most important thing. At a young age, I don't remember where it was a book I was reading or something. I was exposed to this idea of, someone being in the mindset that, like a sort of one day in the future, I'll be able to whatever. And then, this character in some novel or something waking up one day going, oh my God, I'm 60 and, I've just lived my whole career. Like, and I just thought, my God, what an awful idea. That scared the hell out of me. And I just thought, whatever else happens, I'm never going to wake up one day and go, oh gosh, I've been anticipating and it's already passed me by, So I remind myself, it's like a daily mantra. This is real life. I'm in the middle of it. I'm living it. And it's important to make the most of it. I say that to mentees all the time, especially the ones who are still in college. I bet everybody around you is talking about the real world and real life. They go, oh yeah. I go, you're in the real world. This is your real life. It already started. You should be making the most of it right now, right? There's no great inflection point where someone comes to you and goes, behold, you are now an adult. Here's your adult card. You know what I mean? It doesn't happen. You need to be present in the moment, I guess, for lack of a better word.
So Levi, how do you take care of yourself?
So I think it's a question of prioritization. And I will say, because everything I'm about to say, any like parent is going to just start laughing or maybe crying, right? I am not a parent. I don't have children. So I think that's a really important thing to put up front, right? Because that's a whole other set of priorities that you have to factor into your life. And I have great respect for it. I don't understand it. I haven't experienced it myself, and I'm not going to pretend to. So for me personally, I'm a competitive powerlifter. That's something that's really important to me. So that's a priority, right? I try to get to the gym and lift at least twice a week, unless I'm doing other activities that I feel, swaps in. And then I try to really have a fine-tuned sense of my own sort of capacity and limits, right? And if I'm working throughout the day and I'll get to a point where I go, you know what, I'm tired, I'm not enjoying this, I'm having trouble focusing, and nothing here is an emergency, taking a break. I'm going to go play some video games, take a nap, read a book, whatever I need to do. If it's late in the day, maybe at that point I'm calling it. It's the end of the day. I think it's really just a question of being, for me at least, it's knowing how I like to work, what are my limits, what's my comfort zone, and being very honest with myself about when it is and is not necessary to exceed my comfort zone, because something's really critical and what have you. So I guess it's really, I don't have a clear answer. It's knowing oneself and having a system of constant check-ins with oneself, I guess, is really what it comes down to for me personally.
So Levi, back to the mentoring you do, and hopefully I ask this question right. We're talking about no startups, no idea validation, product market fit, MVP. When should a startup switch from that to like growth mode, so to speak?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. In some sense, never. Because I think that the one thing that you want to be careful of there is, you really never want to say, okay, customer development is now done, testing is now done, and now we execute. Yes, in microcosm, right? If you're testing a new marketing strategy, you can say, okay, now we're done with testing this strategy, let's move forward. But taken as like a holistic statement, no, you should always be engaged in customer development. You should always be talking to your customers, understanding what they want, what they need, and also to people who are not your customers but could have been. Why aren't you our customers, right? And understand that. So I think it's really important to always have kind of that process of constant iterative knowledge collecting going on. As far as shifting from growth to scale, I'm a little hesitant to comment on it, to be honest with you, because my startup isn't quite there. My primary exposure here is through FI, which is startups that are very strongly in growth mode. By the time they're getting to scale mode, I typically don't have a close relationship with them at that point, or at least I haven't yet. None of the startups that I've had a close relationship with have gotten to that point because it's all just been in the past couple of years and it takes longer than that, right? I would say, I guess some of the things I would look for, maybe if I think more as kind of an investor, is I want to look for some evidence of predictability and repeatability, right? I want to see a startup that can say, if we put this much money into this channel, here are the number of customers we will get. Here's what they'll look like. Here's the revenue we're going to get out of it, right? And when you have kind of that level of predictability and insight, where you know what's going to happen when you push certain buttons and pull certain levers, that's typically a really good sign. Obviously, it's assuming that you've established product market fit. And so it's really a question. I use this metaphor not a lot, but I think it's a question of having a decent sense that you have built a machine, you know how it works, you know that it will work, and now you need to think about what kind of fuel you're going to put in it, right? When you're at that early stage of a startup, you're still building the machine. You're trying to figure out if this engine is going to work with the machine, if it's even going to run, and where the heck the engine goes in the first place, right? So that's kind of broadly how I think about it. I'm dodging your question a little bit just because, to be honest with you, I don't think I have the level of expertise to answer that intelligently.
No worries. So Levi, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you, or anything else you want to talk about?
Gosh, no, I think it's been a really enjoyable conversation. Nothing really jumps to mind, but thanks a lot, Jason.
Cool.
It's been fun.
So Levi, I forgot to ask you this during the pre-talk, but is there any like gift or resource you want to give away? Some people do, some people don't.
From our business. Well,
yeah.
I will say right now we are looking for US-based, e-commerce startups to be interested in working with us and participating in a case study. Nothing complex, right? Just where we follow them along for a few months and say, well, where'd they start, where'd they end up, and we'd be more than happy to extend some generous discounts.
All right, I'll get more details from you from the show notes.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to. And we're also putting together some other kind of promotional packages there. So, happy to share more there. But, if someone is curious about Eunimart, curious about what we're doing, and might be interested in kind of doing a pilot test for creating a case study, I would love to have a conversation, and we could definitely look at something.
And can you share your social media for yourself and your company so people can reach out to you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, website's Eunimart.com. It's EUNIMART. You can find us on LinkedIn as well. I apologize, I don't have the URL off the top of my head, but you can definitely find it with a quick search. Or I'm on LinkedIn. It's linkedin.com/in/Levi Reed. Definitely happy to connect with folks. Just ask to give me a little note so I know it's not spam. And of course, you can link to Eunimart from my page as well from there. We've got an Instagram account as well and some other stuff, but I'd say LinkedIn is probably the place to go if you're looking at LinkedIn or our website if you're looking for more information.
And so listener, we'll have the link to his gift in a social media on the show notes. You can find the show notes at www.kevinshblog.com. Be sure to rate, review, subscribe to this episode, and share with your friends. So we're coming to the end of our talk. Can you give us any advice or wisdom about anything you want to talk about? Quick 30-second clip. No pressure.
That's a big question. I guess I think I'd probably just reiterate what I said before. I think it's really important to recognize your priorities, recognize your limits. I think it's important to think about limits. Limits are real and they exist, but they're also typically malleable, right? And as you're growing as a professional, if you're thinking about going into startups, I think it's always an exciting experience to find your limits and test them, and then figure out a plan to expand your capacity in certain areas if you want to. I think it's a question of balancing reality with pragmatism with optimism, right? I'd say that's something that's pretty top of mind for me lately, as I'm finding I'm testing my own limits and capacities, in this new experience.
Levi, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jason. It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for your time as well. Remember to be great every day.